You have experienced this. You finally get what you thought you wanted. The job, the relationship, the achievement, and within days or weeks the satisfaction evaporates, leaving you empty and searching for the next thing. You find yourself repeating the same painful patterns in relationships, choosing the same type of person who hurts you in the same way, even though you swear each time will be different. You scroll through social media compulsively, knowing it makes you anxious and unhappy, yet unable to stop, getting some strange satisfaction from the very thing that depletes you. You present a confident self to the world while internally feeling fragmented, performing a version of yourself that feels both true and false, both you and not you. These are not personal failings. These are not problems that better willpower or positive thinking can solve. These are structural features of what it means to be human, to be a speaking being caught in language, to be a subject split between what you consciously intend and what speaks through you, to be a desiring creature who can never achieve the satisfaction you unconsciously seek. And no one has mapped this territory with more precision, more difficulty, and more disturbing insight than Jacques Lacan. Lacan is not just another psychoanalyst or philosopher you should know about for intellectual credibility. He is the thinker who explains why you are the way you are, why modern life feels the way it feels, why satisfaction is so elusive, why you cannot simply become who you want to be through effort and intention. He discovered that your sense of being a unified self is a necessary fiction, that your deepest desires are not your own but borrowed from others, that language does not express your thoughts but shapes what you can think, that the unconscious is not a primitive reservoir but operates with the precision of grammar, and that you are getting strange satisfaction from your very suffering in ways you cannot acknowledge. Born in 1900 in Paris, dying in 1981, Lacan spent 5 decades developing ideas so challenging that they have sparked equal measures of devotion and fury. His seminars were legendary performances where he would speak for hours without notes, weaving together psychoanalysis, philosophy, mathematics, linguistics, and literature into arguments so dense that even his followers struggled to follow, yet so compelling that intellectuals across disciplines found themselves unable to ignore him. He was expelled from official psychoanalytic institutions for heresy. He created his own schools that fractured into warring factions. He was accused of charlatanism and celebrated as genius. He was deliberately obscure to the point of incomprehensibility, yet influenced everyone from film theorists to political philosophers to literary critics to practicing clinicians. His influence extends everywhere you look once you know what to look for. When you learn that ideology works not by deceiving people but by organizing their enjoyment, that is Lacan. When you understand that gender is a position you occupy rather than a nature you possess, that insight passes through Lacan. When you recognize that consumer capitalism exploits not your needs, but your impossible desire for completion, you are thinking with Lacanian concepts. When you realize that authoritarian leaders appeal not to reason, but to fantasy, offering themselves as the object that will restore lost wholeness, you are using Lacanian analysis. When you see that social media intensifies the fundamental structure of the ego, which is built on seeing yourself from outside and desperately seeking recognition from others, you are encountering what Lacan mapped decades before the internet existed. But Lacan is also genuinely problematic, and this analysis will not shy away from his failures. His writing is obscure beyond any justifiable necessity, creating barriers that exclude rather than enlighten. His use of mathematics is often sloppy, impressive sounding, but not rigorous. His entire framework privileges masculine perspectives, organizing everything around the phallus in ways that subordinate femininity to lack or mystery. His clinical practice was ethically questionable, manipulative, possibly harmful. His institutional behavior was authoritarian, creating cults of personality around himself. His theory can seem pessimistic to the point of political paralysis, suggesting that dissatisfaction is structural and unchangeable. And he has been appropriated by academics who use his jargon to sound sophisticated while saying little of substance. Yet none of these failures erase what he accomplished. Lacan asks the questions that matter most. Why do we desire what we desire? Why does getting what we want so often disappoint? Why do we repeat painful patterns? Why can we not simply know ourselves and act accordingly? Why does love feel impossible even when it is present? Why are we so profoundly divided against ourselves? Why does language both enable and betray us? Why do we get strange satisfaction from our own suffering? And what would it mean to live authentically given the structural impossibility of wholeness? This analysis will take you through the entirety of Lacanian thought with unprecedented clarity and depth. We will not simplify or popularize. We will not trade intellectual rigor for easy accessibility. But we will make every concept concrete, grounded in examples you can recognize from your own life and from contemporary culture. We will examine not just what Lacan said, but why it matters, how it works, where it succeeds brilliantly and where it fails badly. We will explore scholarly debates honestly, showing you how serious thinkers disagree about interpretation and application, giving you the tools to think critically rather than demanding you accept any orthodoxy. You will learn how the mirror stage explains why your self-image is both necessary and fundamentally alienating, built on seeing yourself from outside, from the perspective of the other. You will understand the three registers of imaginary, symbolic and real as dimensions of experience that are always intertwined, irreducible to each other, together constituting how reality feels and functions. You will grasp how entry into language requires accepting castration, accepting that you cannot have everything, that the symbolic order imposes limits that structure all desire. You will see why desire is fundamentally lack, constituted by absence rather than presence, always seeking what it must not find, because finding would be the end of desire itself. You will comprehend how language alienates you from yourself, how the unconscious emerges from the gap between what you mean to say and what speaks through you. You will discover object small a as the cause of desire that cannot be possessed, the nothing that nevertheless drives everything you do. You will analyze the four discourses that structure how power, knowledge and truth circulate in social relations. You will confront Lacan's controversial theory of sexual difference, understanding both its insights and its phallocentric limitations. You will explore jouissance as satisfaction beyond pleasure, the toxic enjoyment that binds you to your symptoms. You will examine his late work on topology and the synthome as attempts to formalize what resists formalization. You will see how these concepts apply to literature, film, politics, and clinical practice. And you will engage seriously with the major critiques that identify real failures in Lacanian theory, learning to think with and against Lacan simultaneously. By the end, you will possess conceptual tools for understanding yourself and your world that you simply cannot get elsewhere. You will see through ideological manipulation more clearly. You will recognize the games of desire and recognition that structure your relationships. You will understand why capitalism keeps you perpetually dissatisfied. You will grasp why you cannot coincide with yourself, no matter how much self-knowledge you accumulate, and you will have the language to articulate experiences that otherwise remain frustratingly ineffable. This will be difficult. Lacan is difficult, and any treatment that makes him seem easy is lying to you, simplifying away precisely what makes his insights powerful. But difficulty is not the same as impossibility, and we will move through this territory together, building understanding step by step, always grounding abstract concepts in concrete examples, always showing you why this matters for your life, for our culture, for how we think about being human. Lacan was right that we are not masters of our own house, that the unconscious speaks through us in ways we cannot control, that desire is impossible and satisfaction elusive, that we are fundamentally split subjects who will never achieve wholeness. But recognizing this is not cause for despair. It is the beginning of something like wisdom, an acceptance of the human condition that makes possible a different relationship to yourself, one that does not demand the impossible, that can find freedom within constraint, that can desire without requiring satisfaction, that can live authentically with division rather than fantasizing about unity. Part 1. The intellectual formation and the radical break. To understand Lacan, you must first grasp the intellectual world he inhabited and the revolution he enacted within it. Lacan trained as a psychiatrist in Paris during the 1920s and 1930s, a moment when French psychiatry was dominated by a concern with describing and classifying mental disorders according to observable symptoms. His doctoral thesis in 1932, written about a woman he called Aimée, who suffered paranoid delusions, already displayed what would become his signature approach, refusing to reduce her condition to mere biological dysfunction, and instead treating her symptoms as meaningful attempts to articulate something about her subjective experience. But the truly formative influence came from his encounter with surrealism and the Parisian avant-garde. Lacan befriended artists like Salvador Dalí and writers like André Breton, absorbing their interest in dreams, automatic writing, and the creative potential of the unconscious. This artistic sensibility would mark all his later work, leading him to present his ideas through elaborate wordplay, paradoxical formulations, and a kind of poetic density that his critics would later call deliberate obfuscation. Yet this style was never merely ornamental. Lacan believed that truth about the unconscious could not be communicated through straightforward scientific prose, because the unconscious itself operates through condensation, displacement, and metaphor. The decisive break came in the early 1950s when Lacan made a scandalous announcement: psychoanalysis had betrayed Freud. In America and elsewhere, psychoanalysis had become what he called ego psychology, a therapeutic approach aimed at strengthening the patient's ego, helping them adapt better to social reality, and resolving conflicts through rational self-understanding. For Lacan, this was a catastrophic misreading of Freud. The ego, he insisted, is not a rational captain steering the ship of the psyche. It is itself a fantasy, an imaginary construction built on misrecognition. This is where his famous slogan emerged, a return to Freud. But this was not a call for conservative orthodoxy. Lacan's return meant reading Freud through the lens of structural linguistics, particularly the work of Ferdinand de Saussure and Roman Jacobson, who had shown that language is not a simple naming of pre-existing things, but a system of differences where meaning arises from relationships between signs. If Freud had discovered that symptoms have meaning, that dreams can be interpreted, that slips of the tongue reveal hidden wishes, then he had implicitly discovered that the unconscious operates according to linguistic principles. This insight, the unconscious is structured like a language, became the foundation of everything Lacan would build. It meant that psychoanalysis was not about uncovering hidden biological drives, but about tracing the signifying chains through which our desires get articulated, distorted, and displaced. It meant that cure was not about ego strength, but about helping the subject recognize the symbolic structures that determine their position. And it meant that human subjectivity is fundamentally split, divided between the speaking subject and the subject of speech, between what we consciously intend to say and what speaks through us. Consider a concrete example. A man keeps choosing romantic partners who ultimately reject him. Traditional ego psychology might interpret this as poor judgment that therapy can correct by strengthening his reality testing. Lacan would ask instead, what is being repeated here? What signifier is at play? Perhaps rejection recreates a founding trauma with a parent. Perhaps being rejected allows him to maintain desire precisely by keeping satisfaction impossible. Perhaps rejection is the only way he knows to feel worthy of love, because he learned early that love means suffering. The symptom is not a mistake to be corrected, but a message to be read, a way the unconscious is speaking through the symptom what cannot be said directly. Lacan's break with ego psychology was not merely theoretical, it was institutional. In 1953, he was expelled from the International Psychoanalytic Association for his controversial practice of variable-length sessions, sometimes ending them after only a few minutes when he felt a crucial point had been made. Rather than the standard 50-minute hour, Lacan argued that the analyst should punctuate the session at moments of significance, forcing the patient to confront what they had just said. His opponents saw this as manipulation and a way to see more patients for more money. Lacan saw it as respecting the logic of the unconscious, which does not operate according to clock time. This institutional battle reveals something essential about Lacan's position. He was always an outsider and provocateur, deliberately cultivating an aura of difficulty and mystique. His weekly seminars in Paris became legendary performances where he would speak for hours without notes, weaving together psychoanalysis, mathematics, topology, literature, and philosophy into dazzling but often impenetrable lectures. He attracted passionate followers who treated his words as scripture, and equally passionate critics who saw him as a charlatan trading in obscurity. Why did Lacan embrace this difficulty? His defenders argue that psychoanalytic truth resists straightforward communication because it concerns precisely what we defend against knowing. The unconscious does not reveal itself to clear and distinct ideas. It emerges through gaps, contradictions, and failures of speech. Therefore, an analytic discourse that is too clear, too easily digestible, risks covering over the very thing it seeks to illuminate. His critics counter that this justification provides cover for sloppy thinking, that genuine insight should be communicable, and that Lacan's obscurity serves mainly to insulate his ideas from critical scrutiny. Regardless of where one stands on this debate, Lacan's influence became undeniable. By the 1960s and 70s, he was arguably the most important intellectual in France. His seminars, attended by everyone from philosophers like Louis Althusser and Jacques Derrida to filmmakers like Jean-Luc Godard. His ideas migrated into literary theory through figures like Roland Barthes, into feminism through theorists like Julia Kristeva and Luce Irigaray, into film studies through scholars like Christian Metz, and into political philosophy through thinkers like Slavoj Žižek. What united all these appropriations was Lacan's central insight that human subjectivity is not natural, not given, but constructed through symbolic systems that precede us and exceed us. We do not choose our language, our culture, our fundamental categories of thought. Rather, we are born into them, and they shape what we can think, desire, and become. Yet this determination is never complete. There is always a remainder, something in us that resists symbolization, that cannot be captured in words, that Lacan would eventually call the real. This framework allowed Lacan to address questions that empirical psychology could not touch. Why do we desire what we desire? Why does satisfaction so often disappoint us? Why do we repeat the same painful patterns? Why does love so often feel impossible? Why does our sense of self feel both utterly certain and strangely fragile? These are not questions about brain chemistry or cognitive processes, but about the structure of human existence as such, about what it means to be a speaking being, a subject caught between nature and culture, between body and language, between desire and law. The stage is now set for exploring the architecture of Lacan's thought in detail. We will proceed through his major conceptual innovations, the mirror stage and the formation of the ego, the three registers of imaginary, symbolic and real, the relationship between desire and the other, the theory of the four discourses, his account of sexual difference and the formulas of sexuation, and his late work on topology and the knot. Each of these domains represents a distinct contribution to psychoanalytic theory, and each has generated its own scholarly debates, applications, and critiques. Part 2. The Mirror Stage and the Birth of the Ego. The mirror stage represents Lacan's first major theoretical contribution, first presented in 1936 and refined throughout his career. It describes a foundational moment in human development, but more importantly, it reveals something permanently true about the structure of the ego itself. What Lacan discovered is that our sense of being a unified, coherent self is built on a fundamental misrecognition, a mistake we can never fully correct. Picture an infant between 6 and 18 months old placed before a mirror. Unlike other animals who quickly lose interest in their reflection, the human child displays jubilant fascination. The child sees a coordinated, unified image, a whole body moving together, and something remarkable happens. The child identifies with this image, saying, in effect, "That is me." But here is the paradox. At this developmental stage, the infant's actual experience of their body is fragmented, uncoordinated, characterized by motor helplessness. The infant cannot yet walk, cannot control their limbs with precision, experiences their body as bits and pieces rather than as an integrated whole. So the infant identifies with an image of completeness that does not match their lived reality. The ego, the sense of I, is born from this external image. Lacan calls this an imaginary identification, using the term imaginary not to mean false or unreal, but to indicate that it belongs to the register of images, of visual gestalt, of form. The child says, I based on seeing a you, based on recognizing themselves from outside, from the place of the image. This foundational structure has permanent consequences. First, the ego is always based on an alienating identification. We become ourselves by identifying with something external to us. We see ourselves from outside before we feel ourselves from inside. This means the ego is structurally other. It is me as seen by the other, me as I imagine myself to appear. Second, the ego is always compensatory, always covering over a fundamental lack of coordination, lack of wholeness. We walk around feeling like unified persons, but this unity is a defensive construction against our underlying fragmentation. Consider how this plays out in everyday experience. Think about seeing yourself in a photograph or hearing your recorded voice. There is often a jarring moment, a feeling of that is not me, or more precisely, that is me, but it feels alien. This reveals the gap between the ego built on imaginary identification and our lived subjective experience. Or consider how we constantly imagine how we appear to others, how we adjust our behavior based on how we think we are being seen. This is not mere social anxiety, but reveals the fundamental structure of the ego itself. It is built from the outside in, from the image that the other sees. The mirror stage also introduces a critical Lacanian concept. The imaginary relation is fundamentally aggressive and rivalrous. When the child sees their reflection, they see not just themselves, but also a rival, a double, someone who might replace them. Lacan argues that human aggression does not stem primarily from frustrated drives, but from this primordial situation where the other is both me and not me, both the image I need to be whole and a threatening competitor. Every human relationship contains this imaginary dimension, where the other becomes the screen onto which we project our own ideal image or our own inadequacy. Think about romantic jealousy. Why does seeing your partner with someone else provoke such intense affect? Traditional psychology might say it is fear of loss, but Lacan would add another dimension. The rival represents an image of yourself, showing you what you might be, what the other might prefer. The rival is both other and a mirror, reflecting back your own insufficiency. Or consider workplace competition. Why does a colleague's success sometimes feel like a personal attack? Because in the imaginary register, their success threatens your image of yourself. It shows you a version of what you are not, exposing the gap between your ideal ego and your actual accomplishments. Lacan distinguishes between the ideal ego and the ego ideal, two terms that sound similar but mark a crucial difference. The ideal ego is the imaginary perfect version of oneself, the image of mastery and completeness glimpsed in the mirror. It is narcissistic, focused on the image itself, on appearing perfect, on being admired. The ego ideal, by contrast, is a symbolic function, an internalized standard or authority that judges whether you measure up. The ideal ego asks, am I beautiful? Am I admired? The ego ideal asks, am I good? Am I living up to the law, to what is expected of me? This distinction helps explain different forms of psychological suffering. Someone dominated by ideal ego pursuits might become obsessed with appearance, with status symbols, with anything that maintains the narcissistic image of perfection. They might experience any flaw or imperfection as catastrophic because it threatens the entire imaginary edifice. Someone struggling with the ego ideal might experience chronic guilt, a sense of never being good enough, constantly judged by internalized standards they can never satisfy. Now we must address a common misunderstanding. Some readers interpret the mirror stage as a developmental phase that we pass through and leave behind. But Lacan insists that the mirror stage describes a permanent structure of human subjectivity. We never stop constructing our ego through imaginary identifications with external images. Every time we compare ourselves to others, every time we imagine how we appear, every time we strive toward an idealized self-image, we are reenacting the mirror stage. The ego is not something we have, but something we continually construct through alienating identifications. The clinical implications are profound. If the ego is built on misrecognition, then the goal of psychoanalysis cannot be to strengthen the ego, as American ego psychology claimed. Strengthening the ego would mean reinforcing the very alienation and misrecognition that structure neurotic suffering. Instead, Lacanian analysis aims to help the subject recognize the imaginary nature of their ego identifications, to see through the mirror, to accept the fundamental lack that the ego tries to cover over. Critics have raised several important objections. First, the empirical basis of the mirror stage is questionable. Developmental psychologists point out that infant recognition of mirror images is more complex than Lacan suggests, and many aspects of his account do not align with current research on infant development. Lacan based his theory on observations from a time when developmental psychology was far less sophisticated. His defenders respond that the mirror stage is not meant as an empirical claim about infant development, but as a structural logic, a way of understanding how the ego functions regardless of the precise developmental timing. Second, some feminists have criticized the mirror stage for being too visual, too focused on the image, potentially privileging a masculine way of relating to the body. Luce Irigaray, for instance, argues that Lacan's entire framework is phallocentric, organized around seeing and having rather than other forms of bodily experience more associated with femininity. This critique opens onto larger questions about whether Lacan's theory can adequately account for sexual difference, a question we will address in detail later. Third, critics from cognitive science and neuroscience argue that Lacan's rejection of the ego as rational agent throws out important capacities for self-regulation, planning, and reality testing. They point out that whatever the ego's origins, it performs real functions that cannot be dismissed as mere alienation. Lacanians counter that they are not denying these functions, but questioning their ontological status, showing that what appears as rational agency is always structured by unconscious symbolic and imaginary coordinates. The mirror stage also establishes a pattern that will repeat throughout Lacanian theory. Human beings are fundamentally split, alienated from themselves at the most basic level. We are never fully present to ourselves, never fully self-identical, always seeing ourselves from outside, always mediated by images and symbols that come from the other. This is not a problem to be solved, but the condition of human subjectivity itself. We are the speaking animals who can say, I. But this very capacity to say I requires that we take up a position outside ourselves, that we identify with an image or signifier that represents us but is never identical to us. Consider how social media intensifies the logic of the mirror stage. We curate images of ourselves. We present idealized versions. We constantly monitor how we appear to others through likes, comments, shares. We construct our identity through external validation, through the images that others see and affirm. The anxiety and compulsiveness of social media use reflects the fact that it plugs directly into the imaginary register, where the ego is always precariously dependent on recognition from the other, where we can never be sure the image holds. Yet Lacan would insist this is not a new problem created by technology, but an intensification of the structural condition of the ego itself. The mirror stage thus gives us our first glimpse of Lacan's radical thesis. The ego is not the hero of psychoanalysis, but its primary obstacle. The ego is where we get stuck in imaginary relations, in narcissistic rivalry, in defensive attempts to maintain a coherent self-image. True analytic work must move beyond the imaginary register to the symbolic order, to the realm of language, law, and the other. But the imaginary never disappears. It remains as a permanent temptation, a pull toward the specular image, toward the fantasy of wholeness and mastery. Part 3. The three registers: imaginary, symbolic, and real. To navigate Lacan's thought, you must grasp his fundamental topology of experience, what he calls the three registers: the imaginary, the symbolic, and the real. These are not three different zones or levels, but three dimensions that are always intertwined, each irreducible to the others, together constituting the structure of human reality. Understanding these three registers is like learning to see in three dimensions. It reveals depths and relations that were previously invisible. We have already encountered the imaginary register through the mirror stage. The imaginary is the dimension of images, of similarity and difference, of identification and rivalry, of the visible gestalt. It is characterized by dual relations, by one-to-one correspondences, by the fantasy of complementarity. In the imaginary, we seek wholeness through fusion with the other. We want to complete ourselves, to overcome our lack through imaginary union. Think of the fantasy of romantic love, where two incomplete halves come together to form a perfect whole. This is imaginary logic. The imaginary gives us crucial experiences, our sense of bodily integrity, our ego identifications, our aesthetic responses to beauty and form. But it is also the register of misrecognition, of narcissism, of aggressive rivalry. When we are caught in purely imaginary relations, we are trapped in mirror games where the other is either an ideal to emulate or a rival to destroy. The imaginary is necessary but insufficient. We cannot live without it, but we cannot live authentically within it alone. The symbolic register is the dimension of language, of signifiers, of law and social structure. This is the order that makes us properly human, that distinguishes us from animals. While animals live in an imaginary dyad with their environment, responding to images and signals, humans inhabit a symbolic universe where meaning is generated through differential relations between signifiers. The symbolic is the realm of the other, with a capital letter, the social and linguistic order that precedes us and determines our possibilities. Here is what makes the symbolic so strange and so crucial. A signifier, a word or symbol, does not get its meaning from pointing to a thing in the world. Rather, signifiers get their meaning from their difference from other signifiers within a system. The word dog means what it does not, because it resembles dogs, but because it is not cat, not house, not run, not anything else in the language. Meaning is always relational, always a matter of position within a structure. This has profound implications. It means that we do not choose our language, we are born into it, and it determines what we can think and say before we even start speaking. The symbolic order is the realm of names, of kinship structures, of grammar, of all the rules and categories that organize social life. When I say I take up a position within language. I become a place in the symbolic structure, but this position never fully captures who I am. Lacan's most famous slogan about the symbolic is this: "The unconscious is structured like a language." What does this mean, concretely? It means that symptoms, dreams, slips of the tongue all operate according to linguistic mechanisms. Freud had identified condensation and displacement as the primary processes of dream work. Lacan recognized these as identical to the linguistic operations of metaphor and metonymy. Metaphor works by substitution, one thing standing in for another based on similarity. If I dream of a house representing my mother's body, that is metaphor, one image substituting for another. Metonymy works by contiguity, by association, by part standing for whole. If I become obsessed with shoes because they were present at a traumatic scene, that is metonymy, meaning sliding along a chain of associations. Consider a clinical example. A woman develops a paralyzed arm for which no physical cause can be found. In Freud's era, this was called hysteria, a conversion symptom where psychological conflict becomes physical symptom. Lacan would say the symptom is a signifier. It means something. It is trying to say what cannot be said directly. Perhaps the paralyzed arm is saying, "I cannot reach out, I cannot grasp what I desire, I cannot strike the person who hurt me." The arm is not simply broken, it is speaking, but in the language of the body rather than words. The analytic work is to help the patient translate the symptom back into speech, to recognize what the symptom is saying. The symbolic register is also the register of the law, of prohibition, of what Lacan calls the name of the father. We will explore this in detail shortly, but the basic idea is that entry into language requires accepting a fundamental no, a prohibition that structures desire. The symbolic order tells us we cannot have everything. We cannot return to imaginary fusion with the mother. We must renounce immediate satisfaction and accept mediation through language and social rules. Now we come to the most difficult and most important register, the real. The real is not reality, not the empirical world of objects. Rather, the real is what resists symbolization, what cannot be integrated into the symbolic order, what remains outside language. The real is the traumatic kernel that we circle around but cannot grasp, the impossible that makes itself felt through its effects but can never be directly represented. Think of the real as the limit of what can be said. No matter how much we speak, something always escapes, something that language cannot capture. The real is not simply unknown, but unknowable in principle. It is what would fall out of symbolization even if we had infinite time and infinite words. The real is the dimension of pure contingency, of brute facticity, of the encounter that disrupts all our symbolic frameworks. Lacan sometimes identifies the real with trauma. A traumatic event is real in this technical sense because it overwhelms our capacity to symbolize it, to integrate it into our narrative, to give it meaning. The trauma keeps returning, keeps insisting, precisely because it was never properly symbolized, never fully integrated into the subject's history. Repetition compulsion, the way we keep repeating painful patterns, reflects the real trying to become symbolized, the real knocking at the door of the symbolic. But the real is also related to the body in its material density, in its resistance to meaning. Your biological existence, your birth, your death, your sexual anatomy, these have a real dimension that exceeds whatever symbolic meanings get attached to them. I might tell myself all sorts of stories about my body, but there remains something irreducibly real about embodiment, about pain, about the sheer there-ness of flesh that cannot be reduced to discourse. Here is a concrete way to grasp the three registers simultaneously. Imagine a person with chronic pain, for which doctors can find no physical cause. In the real, there is the brute experience of pain itself, the pure suffering that exceeds meaning. In the symbolic, the pain gets interpreted, given meaning, perhaps as punishment for guilt, perhaps as a way to get care from others, perhaps as proof of some underlying disease. In the imaginary, the person constructs an image of themselves as sick, as suffering, as special or cursed because of their pain. All three registers are simultaneously present, irreducible to each other. Or consider money as another example. At the level of the real, money is paper or metal or electronic entries, material stuff with no intrinsic value. At the level of the symbolic, money is a signifier within an economic system, its value coming purely from its position in a structure of exchange, from what it is not, from its difference from other values. At the level of the imaginary, money becomes an object of fantasy, something that will complete us, make us whole, allow us to have the perfect life we imagine. Lacan's topology becomes more complex in his later work, when he argues that the three registers are knotted together like a Borromean knot, a configuration where if any one ring is cut, all three fall apart. This means the three registers are mutually dependent. Each requires the others to function. None has priority. This is a difficult idea, but it challenges any reductionism that would try to explain everything through one register, whether that is symbolic determinism, imaginary psychology, or biological materialism. Let me give you a practical application in understanding ideological power. Ideology does not work simply through ideas or images or material force. It operates across all three registers. Take nationalism. At the imaginary level, nationalism works through identification with an idealized image of the nation, through symbols like flags and anthems that produce feelings of unity and belonging. At the symbolic level, nationalism is inscribed in laws, in citizenship status, in language itself, in narratives about national history and destiny. At the level of the real, nationalism is tied to bodies, to the physical territory that grounds identity, to the traumatic experiences of war and violence that cannot be fully symbolized, but nevertheless determine collective life. Understanding how all three registers operate simultaneously allows for more sophisticated political analysis. You cannot defeat ideology simply by rational argument, by showing that national myths are false, because ideology is not operating only at the symbolic level. You must also address the imaginary investments and the real antagonisms that nationalism organizes. Critics have challenged the coherence of Lacan's three registers from multiple angles. Some philosophers argue that the real is an incoherent concept, a mystical, beyond that smuggles metaphysics back into psychoanalysis. If the real is by definition unsymbolizable, how can Lacan theorize it? How can he say anything about it at all? Lacanians respond that the real is known through its effects, through the points where symbolization fails, through the rocks on which speech founders. The real is not outside theory, but the limit internal to theory, the point where theory encounters what it cannot digest. Others argue that Lacan's symbolic determinism, his emphasis on language constituting the subject, leaves no room for agency, for resistance, for change. If we are thoroughly determined by the symbolic order, what hope is there for transformation? Lacanians counter that the registers do not determine us mechanically, but provide the coordinates within which our singular history unfolds, and that analysis works precisely at the points where the symbolic shows its gaps and inconsistencies. Still others, particularly phenomenologists, object that Lacan's three registers ignore lived experience, the first-person perspective, the texture of consciousness. By focusing on structural positions and topological relations, does not Lacan lose the subject itself? This debate touches on fundamental questions about whether subjectivity can be adequately described in structural terms, or whether it requires irreducible phenomenological description. What remains undeniable is that the three registers provide an extraordinarily powerful analytic framework. They allow us to see how meaning is constructed across multiple dimensions simultaneously, how human reality is always mediated, yet never exhausted by its mediations. The registers prevent us from reducing complexity to simplicity, from thinking that either biology or culture or consciousness alone can explain human existence. We are creatures suspended between these three dimensions, never at home in any one of them, always divided. Part 4. The name of the Father and entry into the symbolic order. Now we approach one of Lacan's most controversial and most consequential concepts, the name of the Father. This idea explains how a human infant becomes a speaking subject, how they enter the symbolic order and what price must be paid for this entry. It is also the concept that has provoked the most intense feminist critique, so we must examine both its explanatory power and its limitations. Lacan begins from a Freudian insight. The Oedipus complex is not just one developmental stage among others, but the decisive structuring moment of human subjectivity. But Lacan radically reinterprets what the Oedipus complex means. It is not primarily about literal sexual desires for the mother and rivalry with the father, though these may appear at the imaginary level. Rather, the Oedipus complex names the structural passage from nature to culture, from the imaginary dyad with the mother to the symbolic order of language and law. Here is the basic structure. The infant begins in what appears as fusion with the mother, a dyadic relationship where the mother seems to satisfy all needs, where there is not yet a clear boundary between self and other. The infant experiences the mother as omnipotent, as the source of all satisfaction, and crucially, the infant tries to be what the mother desires, to be the object that would complete her, that would fill her lack. This is still an imaginary relation, characterized by the fantasy of completing the other, of being everything to the mother. But then something happens, the father intervenes. Not necessarily the biological father, but what Lacan calls the name of the father, a symbolic function, a paternal metaphor that introduces separation and law. The father, or the paternal function, says no to the imaginary fusion, insists on separation, represents the wider symbolic order into which the child must enter. The father says, in effect, you cannot possess the mother. She is not yours. She desires beyond you. There is a law that precedes and exceeds this dyadic relation. This intervention is traumatic but necessary. It castrates the child, but castration here means something specific in Lacanian theory. It means accepting that you cannot be everything, that you are lacking, that you cannot fill the mother's desire, that satisfaction is impossible. Castration in this symbolic sense means accepting limitation, finitude, the fact that the other is also lacking, also incomplete. The name of the father is what allows this castration to be accepted. By installing a symbolic law, by giving a name to the prohibition, the father makes the no-bearable, meaningful part of a structure. The prohibition is not arbitrary parental cruelty, but participation in the symbolic order, in language, in culture. By accepting castration, by giving up the fantasy of fusion with the mother, the child gains access to something far more powerful. They gain speech. They gain the capacity to say, I. They enter into the human world of meaning and possibility. Let me make this concrete with an example. A young boy is intensely attached to his mother, wants to sleep in her bed, becomes distressed when she leaves, feels that her presence is everything. The father insists on separation, enforces a boundary, says, no, you have your own bed, your mother and I have our relationship, you must accept that you are not the center of her world. This intervention can feel like violence to the child, like a loss of everything. But it opens the child to a larger world. It says you must find your place in the symbolic order. You must speak rather than simply cling. You must accept that desire is mediated through language and law rather than through imaginary possession. The name of the father thus has several functions. First, it separates the child from the mother, breaking the imaginary dyad. Second, it introduces the symbolic dimension, the realm of language, names, and law. Third, it installs the fundamental signifier that grounds the entire symbolic order, giving stability and meaning to the subject's position. Fourth, it transmits desire by showing that the mother desires something beyond the child, that desire is always directed towards something other, something lacking. What happens when the name of the father fails to function, when this symbolic intervention does not occur? Lacan argues this leads to psychosis. In neurosis, which includes what we commonly think of as normal psychology, the name of the father has been accepted, even if ambivalently, even if it causes suffering. The neurotic subject is inscribed in the symbolic order, accepts castration, struggles with desire and prohibition. But in psychosis, the name of the father has been foreclosed, rejected at the most fundamental level, never properly integrated. In psychosis, the symbolic order does not function as it should, language becomes strange, reality itself becomes uncertain. Without the paternal metaphor anchoring meaning, signifiers start floating freely, hallucinations and delusions emerge, the boundary between inside and outside breaks down. The psychotic subject is not simply ignorant of reality, but has a different relation to the symbolic itself, one where the fundamental stabilizing function has failed. Consider paranoid delusions. The paranoid person feels persecuted, feels that messages are being sent specifically to them, that reality is organized around them in threatening ways. Lacan would say this reflects the failure of symbolic separation. The psychotic subject has not accepted that they are not the centre, that the other has their own desire, that not everything refers back to the subject. The delusion is an attempt to construct meaning where the normal symbolic function has failed, a desperate effort to make sense of an unanchored reality. Now we must confront the feminist critique of the name of the father, and it is a powerful one. Why does Lacan privilege the father? Why does entry into the symbolic order require paternal law rather than maternal law or some gender-neutral principle? Is not Lacan simply ratifying patriarchy, making male authority seem necessary to human development itself, naturalizing what is actually a contingent social arrangement? Lacan's defenders make several arguments. First, they insist that the father is not the empirical father, but a symbolic function, that it could in principle be occupied by anyone or anything that interrupts the mother-child dyad and introduces law. The name of the father is a metaphor for the symbolic order itself, for the introduction of language and prohibition. Second, they argue that Lacan is describing how our current symbolic order functions, not prescribing how it must function, that his theory reveals rather than endorses patriarchy. But these defences are not fully satisfying. If the paternal function could really be occupied by anything, why does Lacan insist on calling it the name of the father? Why not the name of the other, or the name of the law, or some non-gendered term? The language itself suggests that Lacan sees something essential about paternity and masculinity in the function of symbolic authority. Moreover, if Lacan is merely describing our current symbolic order, is he not trapped within it, unable to imagine alternatives? Feminists like Luce Irigaray argue that Lacan's entire framework is phallocentric, organized around presence and absence, having and lacking in ways that make femininity appear as pure negativity, as lack without positive content. For Irigaray, we need an entirely different symbolic economy, one that can recognize sexual difference without subordinating femininity to a masculine logic of the one. Other feminists, like Juliet Mitchell, have argued that Lacan's theory is actually useful for feminism precisely because it shows how patriarchy operates at the level of the symbolic, not the biological. If gender is inscribed through language and law rather than nature, then it can potentially be reinscribed differently. The fact that Lacan shows how deeply patriarchy shapes subjectivity does not mean he endorses it. It means he reveals how much work feminist transformation would require. This debate remains unresolved in contemporary theory. What seems clear is that Lacan's concept of the name of the father captures something important about how symbolic authority functions in patriarchal societies, but that its universalizing claims, its suggestion that this is the structure of human entry into language as such, are far more questionable. Let me offer a more culturally specific reading. In Western patriarchal societies, entry into language does typically involve identifying with or positioning oneself in relation to masculine authority, does typically involve a paternal metaphor that structures meaning and desire. Lacan's theory illuminates this structure with remarkable clarity. But this does not mean that entry into language must always take this form, that there could not be symbolic orders organized differently, that the name of the father is a transcultural necessity rather than a contingent historical formation. We can also examine the name of the father in relation to contemporary family structures. What happens in families without fathers, in families with two mothers, in families with non-binary parents. Does the lack of a father necessarily lead to psychosis, as a crude reading of Lacan might suggest? Clinical evidence suggests not that the paternal function can be enacted by various figures and in various ways, that what matters is some form of symbolic intervention that introduces law and separation, not the specific gender of who provides it. Yet we must also acknowledge that growing up in a patriarchal society means that paternal authority and masculine law are inscribed everywhere, not just in individual families. The name of the father might be transmitted through schools, through religious institutions, through legal systems, through language itself, which in gendered languages often makes masculine forms the universal. One valuable application of the name of the father concept is understanding fundamentalism and authoritarianism. These movements often arise when symbolic authority seems to be collapsing, when traditional paternal law no longer seems to hold. The fundamentalist response is to reinstall a rigid, unquestionable name of the father, to shore up symbolic authority by making it absolute, by refusing any ambiguity or questioning. This can be understood as a defensive reaction against the vertigo of a symbolic order that admits its own gaps and inconsistencies. Consider how right-wing populism often frames itself as defending the father, defending traditional authority against forces of dissolution and chaos. The appeal is to those who feel unmoored by the collapse of traditional symbolic structures, who desperately want the name of the father reinstalled to provide certainty and meaning. Understanding this dynamic does not mean endorsing it, but it helps explain why simply pointing out the irrationality of authoritarian movements often fails. People are seeking symbolic anchorage, not rational arguments. The name of the father remains one of Lacan's most challenging concepts, irreducible to simple summary or easy application. It captures something crucial about how symbolic authority functions, about the price of entry into language, about the structural impossibility of full satisfaction. But it also carries problematic associations with patriarchy that Lacan never fully worked through, that remain sites of productive struggle in contemporary theory. Part 5. Desire, Demand and Need, the subject's impossible quest. We now enter the heart of Lacanian theory, his account of desire. For Lacan, desire is not a biological drive or a psychological want, but the very structure of human existence, the permanent condition of being caught between need and demand, between nature and culture, between the body and language. Understanding Lacanian desire means understanding why satisfaction is impossible, why getting what we think we want so often disappoints, why human beings are creatures who cannot coincide with themselves. Lacan distinguishes between three terms that English collapses together: need, demand, and desire. Need belongs to the biological realm. It is hunger, thirst, warmth, all the requirements of organic life. An animal experiences need and satisfies it directly. When a dog is hungry, it eats. When it is full, the need is satisfied. Need operates in the real, in the body's relation to what it requires for survival. But human beings cannot satisfy needs directly because we are speaking beings, because all our needs must be articulated through language addressed to another. The infant who is hungry cannot simply satisfy hunger. They must cry, must call for the mother, must make their need into a demand. And this changes everything. Demand is need articulated through speech, addressed to the other. When I demand, I am not merely asking for a specific object, but asking for recognition, asking for love, asking the other to respond to me. Even the most concrete demand, give me food, give me warmth, contains an implicit meta-message. Recognize me, care about me, prove that you love me. Demand is always at bottom a demand for love, for the other's presence and attention, for proof that I matter. Here is the crucial step. Because demand can never be fully satisfied, because no response from the other can provide absolute assurance of love, because even when my need is met, I am left wanting something more, something else emerges, desire. Desire is what remains after need is subtracted from demand. It is the surplus, the excess, what I continue to want even when I have everything I need and everything I asked for. Lacan's formula is both simple and profound. Desire is the difference between demand and need, or more precisely, desire emerges in the gap between what the subject needs biologically and what they demand symbolically. I might need food, I demand that you feed me, but what I desire is something neither the food nor your feeding can provide. I desire your desire. I desire to be the object of your desire. I desire to know what you want from me. This means that desire is always desire of the other, in a double sense. First, it is desire for the other's desire. I want to be what you want. I want to figure in your fantasy. Second, it is a desire borrowed from the other. I desire what the other desires. My desire is always mediated by the other's desire, shaped by what I perceive the other values. Consider romantic desire as an example. At the level of need, I might require sexual satisfaction, warmth, companionship. At the level of demand, I ask you to love me, to be with me, to choose me. But desire goes beyond both. What I really want is to be the object that causes your desire, to be that which you cannot do without, to occupy the place in your fantasy of the thing that would complete you. This is why romantic love is so fraught with anxiety, because I can never be certain that I really am what you desire. I can never fully see myself as you see me. I'm always guessing at what you want and trying to become it. Or consider consumer desire. Advertising works not by addressing needs, but by creating demands that imply a deeper desire. A car commercial does not simply show you a vehicle that will transport you from place to place. That is need. It shows you beautiful people in beautiful places. It implies that owning this car will make you desirable to others, will make you the object of their desire, will give you the identity you lack. The car is supposed to be what Lacan calls the object small a, the object that would fill your lack, that would make you whole. Of course, it never does, which is why you keep buying, keep consuming, keep searching for the next object that will finally satisfy. Lacan insists that desire is fundamentally lack. It is constituted by an absence, not by the presence of an object. This is difficult to grasp because we usually think of desire as wanting something, as being oriented toward obtaining an object. But Lacan argues that if desire were simply wanting an object, then getting the object would end desire, and experience teaches us this is not true. Getting what we thought we wanted often leaves us empty, disappointed, immediately searching for something else. The structure of desire is such that it must be kept alive, must avoid satisfaction, because satisfaction would be the death of desire itself. We do not really want to get what we desire, because then we would have to confront the fact that this was not really it, that our lack persists, that we are still divided subjects who cannot find rest in any object. Think about fantasy in this context. Fantasy is not a simple wish fulfillment, but the scenario that sustains desire, that keeps desire alive by keeping satisfaction at a distance. The obsessive neurotic fantasizes about the perfect conditions under which they could finally act, finally declare their love, finally begin their life, but these perfect conditions are designed never to arrive, because arriving would require actually risking rejection, actually confronting the real. The fantasy keeps desire alive by keeping it unfulfilled. Or consider the common experience of pursuing someone until they become interested, then losing interest once they are available. This is not simply fear of intimacy, but reveals the structure of desire itself. Desire wants the other's desire, but once that desire is definitively given, once there is no more mystery, no more lack in the other, desire evaporates. We desire the other as lacking, as incomplete, as desiring something beyond what we can give them, because this sustains the question of what they want, which is the question that drives desire. Lacan distinguishes desire from drive, another crucial concept borrowed from Freud, but transformed. Drives are partial. They attach to specific bodily zones, oral, anal, scopic, invocatory, the drive to see, to be heard, to consume, to expel. Unlike desire, which is always desire for something else, always sliding toward new objects, drive circulates around its object in a kind of loop, getting satisfaction not from obtaining the object, but from the circular movement itself. The drive is more primitive, more insistent than desire. While desire is caught up in meaning, in symbolization, in the dialectic with the other, drive operates below or beyond meaning, in a repetitive insistence that seeks not satisfaction, but something Lacan calls jouissance, a form of pleasure in pain, of satisfaction beyond the pleasure principle. We will explore jouissance in detail later, but for now note that drive represents a dimension of subjectivity that does not fully pass into the symbolic, that remains tied to the body's strange pleasures. The clinical implications of Lacan's theory of desire are profound. If neurotic suffering stems from the impossible position of desire, from the subject's attempt to be what the other desires while knowing this is impossible, then analysis cannot work by offering better objects or strategies for satisfaction. Instead, analysis must help the subject come to terms with desire itself, with the structural impossibility of satisfaction, with the fact that they are divided beings who will never find rest in any object or any identity. This means helping the subject traverse their fantasy, to see through the scenarios that sustain their desire, to recognize that no object will complete them, that their lack is not a problem to be solved, but the condition of their existence as speaking beings. This can sound pessimistic, even nihilistic, but Lacanians would say it is realistic. It is accepting the human condition rather than chasing impossible fantasies of wholeness. Critics from many directions have challenged Lacan's account of desire. Deleuze and Guattari, in their influential work Anti-Oedipus, argue that Lacan reduces desire to lack, making it fundamentally negative, when desire should be understood as productive, as creative, as machinic production of the new. Why must desire be constituted by absence? Why cannot desire be affirmative plenitude, joy in creation and connection? Lacanians respond that Deleuze and Guattari misread the concept of lack, that Lacanian lack is not a negative absence, but the very structure of subjectivity itself, the gap that makes symbolic and creative activity possible. Without lack, without the gap opened by language and castration, there would be no desire at all, only need. The supposed affirmation of Deleuzian desire smuggles in a fantasy of pre-symbolic immediacy that does not exist for speaking beings. Feminist critics point out that Lacan's entire economy of desire seems organized around masculine fantasy, around having and lacking, around the phallus as master signifier. What about desires structured differently? Desires that are not about possession and loss, but about relation and reciprocity. Desires that emerge from bodily experiences Lacan marginalizes. We will address sexual difference in more detail later, but note here that the critique suggests Lacan universalizes a particular masculine structure of desire. Cognitive scientists and evolutionary psychologists argue that Lacan's theory of desire is empirically vacuous, that it makes no testable predictions, that actual desire can be explained much more simply through evolved preferences and reinforcement learning. Why invoke lack, demand, the other, all this heavy theoretical machinery when simpler explanations suffice? Lacanians counter that reductive explanations miss what is distinctively human about desire, miss the way that desire is always mediated by language and the social order, always exceeds biological functionality. The fact that people desire against their own interests, that they repeat destructive patterns, that they want what they do not want, that satisfaction disappoints, all this resists simple evolutionary or cognitive explanations and requires something like Lacan's structural account. What remains powerful in Lacan's theory is its ability to explain puzzling features of human experience, why we sabotage ourselves, why we desire most intensely what we cannot have, why satisfaction often feels empty, why we constantly want something more without knowing what that something is. Lacan shows that these are not accidental features or pathologies, but follow from the structure of human subjectivity itself, from the fact that we are speaking beings whose desires are always mediated by language and by the other's desire. The theory also has critical power for understanding ideology and consumer capitalism. If desire is constitutively lack, if it must avoid satisfaction to remain alive, then capitalism's endless production of new commodities, its constant promise that the next product will finally satisfy, exploits the very structure of human desire. Capitalism does not create this structure, but it systematizes it, turns it into an engine of accumulation, offers 1,000 objects to fill a lack that cannot in principle be filled. Understanding this does not make us immune to consumer desire, but it might help us recognize what is really happening when we find ourselves wanting the next thing. Part 6. The Graph of Desire and How Language Alienates the Subject. Lacan's graph of desire represents his most systematic attempt to map the relationship between the subject, language, the other, and desire. Developed in his seminar on the formations of the unconscious in the late 1950s, the graph is notoriously complex, appearing as a series of intersecting lines, vectors, and nodal points. But beneath the intimidating surface lies a powerful account of how speaking alienates us from ourselves, how meaning is never fully under our control, and how the unconscious emerges from the very structure of language. Rather than reproduce the graph's visual complexity, I will explain the key insights it encodes. The fundamental idea is that when a subject speaks, they do not simply express a pre-existing intention. Rather, the act of speech produces effects that exceed and escape conscious control, creating the unconscious as a structural necessity. The graph begins with a simple vector representing the subject's intention, what I want to say, what I mean. But this vector must pass through language, through what Lacan calls the treasure house of signifiers, the existing linguistic structure that precedes any individual speaker. And here is the crucial point. The signifiers available to me never perfectly capture what I want to say. They always introduce a gap, a distortion, a difference between what I mean and what I actually say. Imagine trying to express a subtle emotional state, say a mixture of nostalgia, contentment and melancholy while watching a sunset. Whatever words you choose, happy, sad, moved, wistful, they always feel inadequate. They miss something essential about your experience. You have to use the words available in language, but those words carry meanings that exceed your intention. They connect to other contexts, other uses. They say both more and less than you meant. This is not a failure of expression, but the normal condition of speech. We can only speak by submitting to a language we do not control, by letting signifiers say things we did not consciously intend. The graph shows this as a quilting point or anchoring point, a moment where the vector of intention crosses the chain of signifiers. At this crossing, meaning is retroactively produced, but it is never fully the meaning I intended. It includes an unconscious surplus, an unintended significance that will only become apparent afterward through analysis or through the responses of others. Think about a slip of the tongue. You meant to say one thing, but another word emerges. Freud showed that these slips are not random, but reveal unconscious thoughts, unconscious desires pushing through. Lacan adds that this is not an exception, but the rule. All speech is in a sense a slip. All meaning includes an unconscious dimension, because language operates according to its own logic that exceeds conscious intention. The unconscious is not a hidden depth beneath language, but an effect of language itself, the meanings that circulate beyond what the speaker intended. The graph also maps the relationship between demand and desire. When I speak, I'm always addressing someone, making a demand on the other, asking for recognition or love or acknowledgement. But as we saw in the previous part, demand can never be satisfied, because what I really desire is not the specific thing I ask for, but the other's desire itself. I want to know what you want from me. I want to be the object of your desire. This creates what Lacan calls the question of the subject. What does the other want from me? What am I for the other? What is my place in the other's desire? This question can never be definitively answered because the other is also lacking, also divided, also unable to articulate fully what they want. I address my demand to another. I imagine to be complete, to know what they want, but I discover that the other is barred, marked by the same lack that structures my own subjectivity. Let me offer a concrete example of how this plays out. A child asks their parent, "Do you love me?" The parent says, "Yes, of course I love you." But the child's question is not really answered, because what the child wants to know is not just whether the parent loves them, but what they are for the parent, what place they occupy in the parent's desire, whether they are loved for themselves or as a projection of the parent's own needs. The parent's answer, however sincere, cannot satisfy this deeper question, because the parent also does not fully know what they want, what unconscious investments structure their love. Or consider romantic jealousy through this lens. The jealous person does not simply fear losing their partner, but is tormented by the question, what does my partner see in the rival? What does the rival have that I lack? What is it about me that is not enough? The question, what does the other want, becomes unbearable because it reveals that I am not sufficient, that the other desires something beyond me, that I cannot be the object that completes them. Jealousy is not overcome by reassurance, because reassurance does not answer the structural question of the other's desire. The upper level of the graph introduces what Lacan calls the signifier of the lack in the other, a strange and difficult concept. It names the fact that the big other, the symbolic order itself, is inconsistent, incomplete, does not form a closed totality. Language has gaps, ambiguities, points where meaning fails. The law has exceptions, contradictions, places where it does not fully determine. The other is barred, crossed out, marked by a fundamental lack. This insight has profound implications. It means there is no ultimate authority, no final guarantee of meaning, no position from which everything makes sense. The symbolic order appears to speak with authority, to offer definitive meanings, but this appearance covers over its own inconsistency. The master signifiers that organized meaning, God, nation, freedom, justice, turn out upon examination to be empty, to depend on other signifiers that are equally ungrounded, to generate meaning through their mutual relations rather than by anchoring to some ultimate reality. Religious fundamentalism can be understood as a refusal to accept that the other is barred. The fundamentalist insists that God's word is complete, consistent, fully present, that there is an ultimate authority that guarantees meaning and truth. This denial of the lack in the other provides a sense of security, of grounding, but at the cost of rigidity, intolerance, and violence toward anything that threatens the fantasy of the complete other. The fundamentalist must violently suppress any evidence of inconsistency, any interpretation that reveals gaps or contradictions in the sacred text. At the highest point of the graph, Lacan places jouissance, a term we have mentioned but not yet fully explained. Jouissance is usually translated as enjoyment, but this is misleading because it includes suffering, excess, a kind of satisfaction that goes beyond pleasure into pain. Jouissance is what we get from our symptoms, from our repetitive suffering, from the ways we sabotage ourselves. It is satisfaction that we cannot acknowledge as satisfaction, pleasure that presents itself as suffering, a form of enjoyment that binds us to our problems, even as we consciously wish to be free of them. The graph shows that jouissance is related to the voice and the gaze, to the partial objects that were sites of drive satisfaction before the subject fully entered language. There is something about the mother's voice, the look in the other's eye, that produces an excess of satisfaction, a traumatic intensity that language can never fully integrate. This remainder of unassimilated jouissance continues to circulate in the subject's unconscious, showing up as symptoms, as repetitive patterns, as irrational attachments. Consider addiction as an example of jouissance. The addict consciously wants to stop, knows that their substance, use, is destroying their life, genuinely suffers from the addiction. Yet they continue because the addiction provides a form of jouissance, a toxic satisfaction, a way of getting enjoyment that bypasses the demands of desire, the anxiety of the other's desire. The drug becomes a stand-in for the lost object, the impossible object that would satisfy absolutely. And the addict chooses this certainty of chemical jouissance over the uncertainty and disappointment of desiring through language and relationships. Or think about self-destructive relationships where someone keeps returning to a partner who mistreats them. They genuinely suffer, genuinely want to leave, but they also get something from the suffering, a jouissance that binds them to the relationship. Perhaps the suffering confirms their self-image as unworthy of love. Perhaps it recreates a familiar pattern from childhood. Perhaps there is a strange satisfaction in the intensity of the pain itself. This is not about consciously wanting suffering, but about an unconscious economy of enjoyment that operates beneath conscious intention. The graph of desire ultimately illustrates what Lacan calls the alienation of the subject in language. To speak, I must use signifiers that come from the other, that carry meanings I did not create, that say things I did not consciously intend. The moment I say I split myself into the I who speaks and the I who is spoken, the subject of enunciation and the subject of the statement, and these two never fully coincide. There is always a gap, a non-identity between who I think I am when I speak and who I am in language, in the eyes of the other, in the symbolic order. This alienation is not something to be overcome. It is the condition of being human, of being a speaking subject. We cannot step outside language to express ourselves directly. We cannot become fully present to ourselves. We are always mediated by signifiers that come from elsewhere. The unconscious emerges from this structural alienation as the discourse of the other, as the meanings that circulate beyond conscious control, as the way language speaks through us rather than simply being spoken by us. Critics argue that Lacan's emphasis on alienation is too bleak, too negative, that it leaves no room for authentic self-expression, for genuine communication, for moments of transparency between subjects. They point out that despite alienation, we do manage to communicate, to understand each other, to have meaningful relationships. Why must Lacan always emphasize failure, gap, impossibility? Lacanians respond that acknowledging alienation does not mean communication is impossible, but that it is never simple, never transparent, always requires working through the gap between intention and expression. The moments we experience as authentic connection are real, but they are achieved through, not despite, the mediation of language, through the work of navigating misunderstanding and working toward shared meaning. Moreover, denying alienation, pretending that language is transparent, that we can say exactly what we mean and be fully understood, creates its own problems. It leads to frustration when communication fails, to the feeling that the other is deliberately misunderstanding, to the fantasy that perfect communication should be possible if only everyone would just listen. Accepting that communication is always imperfect, always mediated, always leaving a remainder, might actually improve relationships by creating more realistic expectations and more patience with misunderstanding. The graph of desire, for all its complexity, captures something essential about the human condition. As Lacan understands it, we are beings caught in language, unable to coincide with ourselves, forever asking what the other wants from us, forever seeking an impossible satisfaction that would end desire itself. This is not a problem to be solved, but the very structure of subjectivity, the price we pay for being the speaking animals who can say I, but can never be sure what this I means or what it wants. Part 7. Object small a, the cause of desire that cannot be possessed. We now approach perhaps Lacan's most original and difficult concept, object small a. This strange entity is neither a real object nor a fantasy, but something in between, the object cause of desire, the leftover of the real that resists symbolization yet organizes the entire economy of desire. Understanding object means grasping why desire is inexhaustible, why no actual object ever satisfies, and why human beings are fundamentally driven by something they can neither name nor possess. First, we must clarify what object small a is not. It is not the object of desire in the ordinary sense, not the thing I consciously want, not the person I long for or the goal I pursue. Those are what Lacan calls objects of demand, empirical things I can point to and say, that is what I want. Object A is rather the cause of desire. What sets desire in motion, what makes me desire in the first place, even though I can never directly grasp or possess it. Think of it this way. When I desire something or someone, I'm never simply desiring the empirical object before me. I am desiring something in or behind that object, some excess, some X-factor that I cannot quite name, but that makes this object special, that makes it the object of my desire rather than any other. This something more is object small a. It is what I am really after, even though I mistake it for the empirical object. Lacan sometimes illustrates this with the example of a beautiful face. What makes a face beautiful? What is it exactly that attracts us? It is not reducible to proportions or symmetry or any measurable features, though these might play a role. There is something ineffable, something we cannot quite pin down, that makes this particular face fascinating, that captures our gaze, that we keep returning to. This indefinable something is object A in its scopic dimension, the object that causes the drive to see, that organizes the visual field around itself without ever being fully present as an object we can possess. Or consider the voice as another manifestation of object A. We often fall in love with someone's voice, find it irresistibly attractive, even before we know anything else about them. What is it about the voice that captivates us? What are we hearing? Not just the words, not just the timbre, but something in the grain of the voice, some resonance that speaks directly to our unconscious, that seems to promise something beyond language, some direct contact with the other's being. This is the invocatory object A, the object that causes the drive to hear, to be called by the other's voice. Object A emerges from the process of separation we discussed in relation to the name of the father. When the child must separate from the mother, must give up the fantasy of fusion and completeness, something is lost, something that seemed to promise absolute satisfaction. Object A is the remainder of this loss, the leftover that continues to circulate in the subject's economy of desire. The ghost of the lost object that can never be recovered, but that continues to organize all subsequent desires. This means object A is intimately related to what Freud called the lost object, the thing that never was, that we keep trying to find again in every new love, every new pursuit, every new satisfaction. But Lacan adds a crucial twist. This object was never actually possessed. It was never really there to lose. It is constructed retroactively as having been lost. The infant never actually possessed the mother in the way fantasy suggests. There was never a time of perfect satisfaction. But the fantasy of such a time creates object A as what was supposedly lost. Object A takes different forms corresponding to different partial drives. The breast and feces as oral and anal objects, the gaze and the voice as scopic and invocatory objects, and Lacan later adds the phallus and the nothing as further manifestations. These are not objects in the ordinary sense, but zones where the body's boundary is unstable, where something passes between inside and outside, where the subject's relation to the other is negotiated. The breast, for instance, is neither fully part of the mother nor fully part of the infant. It is the medium of exchange, the site where need becomes demand, where nourishment becomes love. When the breast is withdrawn, when weaning occurs, the breast becomes object A, the lost object that will haunt all future desires, showing up in oral fixations, in eating disorders, in the mouth's role in sexual pleasure. Let me make this more concrete with a contemporary example. Think about social media likes and followers as contemporary manifestations of object A. What exactly do we get from a like? What satisfaction does it provide? Nothing tangible, nothing that addresses any real need, yet we compulsively check. We feel anxiety when posts do not receive likes. We feel a hit of satisfaction when they do. The like functions as object A, as a small token that seems to promise recognition, to give us a taste of the other's desire for us, to confirm that we are desirable, that we matter. But of course, no number of likes truly satisfies. We always want more, because object A is by nature unsatisfiable. It promises a satisfaction it cannot deliver. It keeps desire alive by keeping satisfaction just out of reach. Or consider money as object A. Money seems to promise ultimate satisfaction, the ability to get whatever we want, to fill whatever lack we have. We pursue money compulsively, accumulate it beyond any conceivable need, experience anxiety about not having enough, no matter how much we have. This is because money functions as object A, as the object that supposedly holds the key to desire, that would make us complete if we could just get enough of it. But money can never actually satisfy desire, because desire is not fundamentally about lacking money, but about lacking being, about the structural impossibility of coinciding with ourselves. Lacan's formula is that object A is the object that brings about division in the subject. When I encounter object A, when something functions as the cause of my desire, I am divided between my conscious rational self and my desiring self, between what I know I should want and what I actually want, between the symbolic identity I present to the world and the real of my unconscious fixation. Think about shame as revealing this division. I am ashamed when my object A is revealed, when what I secretly desire becomes visible to others. The addict is ashamed of their compulsion. The person with a fetish is ashamed of what arouses them, not necessarily because these desires are morally wrong, but because they reveal a dimension of subjectivity that exceeds conscious control, that shows me to be divided, not the master of my own house. Fantasy, in the Lacanian sense, is the frame that positions object A. Fantasy is not just daydreaming, but the fundamental scenario that organizes how the subject relates to desire and jouissance, how they position themselves in relation to object A. Lacan writes fantasy as a relationship between the divided subject and object A, showing that fantasy is the way the subject manages their relation to the cause of desire, the way they keep desire alive while keeping jouissance at a safe distance. For example, someone might have a fantasy of being desired by an unattainable other, someone unavailable, someone who barely knows they exist. This fantasy keeps desire alive precisely by keeping satisfaction impossible. The unavailable other becomes object A, the cause of desire that can never be possessed. And the fantasy provides just enough satisfaction to keep going without ever actually resolving anything. Or consider the fantasy of complete independence, of needing no one, of being self-sufficient. This fantasy organizes a relation to object A where the subject attempts to be their own object A, to cause their own desire, to refuse dependence on the other. But this fantasy also reveals its impossibility. The more someone insists they need no one, the more their dependence shows through in symptoms, in unconscious patterns of seeking recognition and care. The clinical work of psychoanalysis in Lacan's late teaching involves what he calls traversing the fantasy. This does not mean giving up on desire or achieving some state beyond fantasy, which would be impossible for a speaking being. Rather, it means coming to see through one's fundamental fantasy, recognizing it as a construction rather than as reality, accepting that object A was never really there to possess, that the satisfaction it promises is impossible, that one can nevertheless live and desire without the guarantee the fantasy seemed to provide. This is extraordinarily difficult because it means accepting a fundamental lack without trying to fill it, accepting that one is a divided subject without the hope of becoming whole. It means giving up on the demand for love as absolute guarantee and accepting that love is always imperfect, always disappointing, always less than what was unconsciously hoped for. Yet Lacanians argue this acceptance is liberating, that it frees the subject from compulsive repetition, from the tyranny of impossible demands, from the suffering of seeking what cannot be found. Critics from multiple traditions have challenged the concept of object A. Phenomenologists argue it is too abstract, too far from lived experience, that actual desire is not structured by such an obscure entity, but by concrete relations to meaningful objects and people. Cognitive scientists say the concept is empirically empty, that it explains nothing that cannot be better explained by reward prediction error, dopamine circuits, and evolutionary psychology. Feminists worry that object A reproduces a masculine logic of lack and possession, that it cannot account for desires structured differently, desires that are relational rather than acquisitive. Yet object A remains one of Lacan's most powerful contributions because it names something that resonates with experience even if it resists direct observation. We have all experienced the way that getting what we thought we wanted leaves us somehow disappointed, the way that the fantasy was better than the reality, the way that we start wanting something else almost immediately. Object A explains this not as a personal failing, but as the structure of desire itself. Desire is caused by an object that it can never actually possess, that loses its allure the moment it is attained, because it was never the empirical object we really desired, but rather the cause of desire circulating beyond any particular object. The concept also has powerful applications for understanding contemporary culture. Consumer capitalism constantly produces new objects that function as object A, promising satisfaction, promising to fill our lack, promising to make us complete. Each new product, each upgrade, each trend offers itself as the object that will finally satisfy, and each predictably disappoints, sending us back to the marketplace for the next object. Understanding object A does not make us immune to this dynamic. but it might help us recognize what is happening, might create some critical distance from the compulsive pursuit of satisfaction through consumption. Similarly, in politics, Object A can help us understand the appeal of authoritarian leaders who present themselves as the object that will restore lost greatness, that will fill the nation's lack, that will make us whole again. The leader functions as Object A, as the supposedly singular object that holds the key to satisfaction, and followers invest them with impossible fantasies of completion and restoration. Recognizing this mechanism might help us see through such appeals, to understand that no leader, no political program, can actually fill the structural lack that defines social existence. Objector remains one of Lacan's strangest concepts, but also one of his most clinically and theoretically productive. It names the gap between what we think we want and what we actually desire, the insubstantial nothing that nevertheless drives everything we do, the cause of desire that can never be captured in demand, yet organizes our entire libidinal economy. Part 8. The Four Discourses, Master University Hysteric and Analyst. In his seminar of 1969 to 1970, entitled The Other Side of Psychoanalysis, Lacan developed his theory of the Four Discourses. This represents one of his most ambitious attempts to formalize social relations, to show how power, knowledge, subjectivity, and truth circulate in different configurations. The four discourses, the discourse of the master, the university, the hysteric, and the analyst, are not just ways of speaking, but fundamental structures of social bonds, ways that subjects relate to each other and to knowledge. Each discourse has four positions arranged in a square. The agent is the position from which the discourse operates, what appears to be driving things. The other is the position that is worked upon, addressed, the recipient of the discourse. The production is what results from the discourse, what it generates as its output. And truth is what motivates the discourse from beneath, what it is really about, even if this remains hidden or disavowed. In the discourse of the master, a master signifier occupies the position of agent, addressing the worker or subject who must produce knowledge. This is the discourse of command, of sovereignty, of the one who knows what needs to be done without needing to justify themselves. The master says, "Do it," and the other must labour to produce knowledge, to make things work, to figure out the details. Meanwhile, what is hidden, what occupies the position of truth, is that the master himself is divided, lacking, does not really know, is anxiously maintaining his authority against its potential collapse. Think of the traditional authority figure, the king, the father, the boss, who simply issues commands without explanation. Their power depends on not revealing uncertainty, on presenting themselves as complete, as knowing what they want, as entitled to command. But beneath this appearance, the master is as divided as anyone, is anxiously defending their position, is dependent on the labour and knowledge of those they command. The master's knowledge is really produced by the slave, by the worker, by those who must figure out how to implement commands. But this knowledge gets attributed back to the master as if it originated with them. In contemporary organizations, we see this discourse whenever a CEO or executive makes sweeping declarations about corporate direction without understanding the actual labor involved, relying on workers to produce the knowledge that makes their commands possible. The executive appears as the agent, as the one driving things, but the real knowledge production happens at other levels, and the executive's own lack of certainty must be carefully concealed. The discourse of the university represents a significant transformation. Here, knowledge itself occupies the position of agent, addressing the subject. This is the discourse of technocracy, of bureaucracy, of rule by expertise and credentials. The university discourse says knowledge must be transmitted, students must be taught, procedures must be followed, all in the name of objective understanding. But what is hidden, what occupies the position of truth, is the master signifier, the unquestioned authority that grounds the entire system. Universities present themselves as neutral sites of knowledge production and transmission, as places where only truth and evidence matter. But Lacan points out that the university discourse still depends on master signifiers that go unquestioned, on fundamental assumptions about what counts as knowledge, about who has authority to speak, about what methods are legitimate. The university discourse produces the subject as the one who lacks knowledge, who must be educated, who must submit to examination and evaluation. We see the university discourse everywhere, in contemporary bureaucracy, in credentialism, in the demand for expertise. Decisions are justified by appealing to data, to research, to expert opinion, as if knowledge itself were commanding rather than people with interests and agendas. The technocrat says we are just following the science, the evidence, the best practices, disavowing the political and ethical choices that structure what counts as evidence and whose expertise matters. The discourse also appears in therapy and self-help culture, where subjects are addressed as lacking knowledge about themselves that experts will provide. The therapist or guru says, I have the knowledge you lack about how to live, about what your symptoms mean, about what you should do, and the client is positioned as the one who must learn, must be educated into health. Lacan's own discourse of the analyst, we will see, attempts to invert this structure. The discourse of the hysteric puts the divided subject in the position of agent, addressing the master and demanding that the master produce knowledge. The hysteric says, I am suffering, I am incomplete, I have symptoms I do not understand. You must explain to me what is wrong. You must give me the knowledge that will cure me. But the hidden truth of the hysteric's discourse is that they are attached to their symptoms, that they do not really want the cure they demand, that their suffering is itself a form of enjoyment, of jouissance that they cannot give up. This might sound like Lacan is pathologizing suffering, but the point is more subtle. The hysteric plays a crucial role in social dynamics. They are the ones who question authority, who refuse to simply accept master signifiers, who insist that something is wrong with the current order. By addressing their symptoms to the master, by demanding that the master explain and cure, the hysteric reveals that the master does not really know, that the master's authority is a pretense. Think about political dissent and social movements. Protesters say the system is broken, we are suffering, you in power must explain this, must justify why things are this way, must provide solutions. This is the hysteric's discourse in operation, and it has real political force because it challenges authority to produce knowledge, to justify itself, potentially revealing the emptiness of its claims. Yet Lacan notes that the hysteric often gets attached to protest itself, to the position of the one who suffers and demands, sometimes even unconsciously sabotaging solutions, because resolution would mean losing this position. In the clinical context, the hysteric comes to analysis asking the analyst to explain their symptoms, to cure them, to tell them who they are. But whenever the analyst offers an interpretation, the hysteric finds it insufficient, unsatisfying, not quite right. This is not resistance in a simple sense, but reveals the structure of hysteria itself, which needs to keep questions alive, to prevent any master discourse from fully answering, to maintain desire by maintaining lack in the other. The fourth discourse is the discourse of the analyst, which Lacan presents as the ethical alternative to the other three. Here, object A occupies the position of agent. The analyst presents themselves as the cause of the analysand's desire, as the object that will supposedly satisfy, but in a way that ultimately reveals the impossibility of this satisfaction. The analyst addresses the divided subject, encouraging them to speak, to free associate, to produce signifiers. What results is knowledge, but knowledge about the analysan's own desire, their own unconscious, not knowledge imposed from outside. And the truth that motivates this discourse is that the analyst herself is castrated, lacking, without the answers the analysand seeks. The crucial difference is that the analyst occupies the position of object a while knowing this is a fiction, a strategic position taken up for the purposes of analysis. The analyst allows the analysed and to suppose that they know, to project their fantasies onto the analyst, but only in order to work through these fantasies to eventually recognise that the analyst does not have the answers, that the subject must assume responsibility for their own desire. This means the analyst must resist the temptation to become a master who commands, or a university professor who educates, or a hysteric who shares their own suffering. The analyst occupies an impossible position, functioning as the object supposed to know while knowing they do not know, presenting themselves as the cause of desire while working toward the traversal of fantasy that would eliminate any such object. Consider how this differs from most therapy. In cognitive behavioral therapy, the therapist occupies the university discourse, possessing knowledge about cognitive distortions and behavioral techniques that they teach to the patient who lacks this knowledge. The goal is education, the transmission of knowledge from expert to client. Lacanian analysis refuses this position because it assumes the knowledge needed is not in the analyst, but in the analysan's own unconscious. And the work is to help the analyze and access what they already know, but do not know they know. The four discourses rotate, one can become another through simple transformations where the positions shift. Lacan suggests that different historical moments are characterized by different dominant discourses. Traditional societies were organized by the master's discourse, by sovereign authority that simply commanded. Modern bureaucratic societies are increasingly organized by the university discourse, by technocratic expertise and knowledge management. Contemporary capitalism might be characterized by what some later Lacanians call the discourse of the capitalist, a fifth discourse where the divided subject believes they can directly access object A through consumption, bypassing the symbolic order entirely. This last point deserves elaboration. In the capitalist discourse, I, as a divided subject, directly address objects of consumption, believing that buying this product will satisfy me, will complete me, will resolve my lack. The capitalist discourse says you can have it all, you do not need to work through language and desire, and the other just buy, just consume, just enjoy. What results is not satisfaction, but more division, more symptoms, more desperate consumption, because the capitalist discourse promises to bypass the very structure that makes satisfaction impossible. And of course it fails, but in failing it generates ever more frantic consumption. Think about how marketing addresses us. Ads say you are incomplete, you are lacking, but this product will complete you, will make you whole, will give you the satisfaction you seek. This directly addresses the divided subject, offering object A in commodity form, promising to resolve the structural lack through purchase. Of course, the product does not satisfy, so the cycle repeats with new products, new promises, new versions of object A on offer. The theory of discourses allows for sophisticated analysis of power relations. Who occupies which position, what is being demanded, what is being produced, what remains hidden, all these questions reveal the structure of social bonds, the way knowledge and authority circulate. For instance, consider the relationship between doctor and patient. Traditionally, the doctor occupies the master's discourse, issuing commands about what the patient must do to get well, with medical knowledge produced behind the scenes by research but attributed to the doctor's authority. But increasingly, medicine shifts toward the university discourse, where medical knowledge itself addresses the patient, where decisions are justified by evidence-based protocols and guidelines, where the doctor presents themselves as merely implementing what knowledge dictates. Meanwhile, patient advocacy groups sometimes occupy the hysterics discourse, demanding that medicine explain their suffering, produce knowledge about their conditions, revealing gaps in medical authority. Or consider the contemporary university itself. Faculty might occupy the university discourse in relation to students, but occupy the hysterics discourse in relation to administration, complaining about conditions, demanding explanations, insisting that something is wrong. Administration might occupy the master's discourse, issuing directives about enrollment and budgets, or increasingly the university discourse, justifying decisions through data and metrics, through the supposed objectivity of knowledge. Critics have raised several objections to the theory of 4 discourses. Some argue it is too schematic, reducing the complexity of social relations to 4 rigid structures. Real interactions are more fluid, more hybrid, more resistant to formalization than Lacan's squares suggest. Others point out that the theory is culture-bound, that it assumes Western structures of authority and knowledge that might not apply elsewhere, that it universalizes what might be historically and geographically specific. Feminist critics note that all 4 discourses seem to operate within a masculine logic of mastery and knowledge, that they do not account for forms of relation and communication that might be organized differently. Where in Lacan's scheme is the discourse of care, of nurturing, of connection, that might not fit the master-slave dialectic. Some sociologists and political theorists argue that Lacan's discourses miss crucial dimensions of power that do not operate through language and symbolic positions, such as direct violence, economic coercion, or the material conditions that shape what can be said. Focusing on discourse might obscure the brute reality of power that operates beneath or beyond speech. Lacanians respond that the theory of discourses is not meant to exhaust social analysis, but to reveal the symbolic structures that organize relations of speech and knowledge. Real situations involve multiple discourses simultaneously, involve shifts between positions, involve the real that resists any discourse. The 4 discourses are ideal types, tools for analysis, not exhaustive descriptions of every interaction. What remains powerful is the theory's ability to denaturalize authority and expertise, to show that what presents itself as objective knowledge or legitimate command is actually a structural position within a discourse, a way of organizing who speaks, who listens, what gets produced, and what remains hidden. The theory gives us leverage for critique, for seeing through the claims of those who present themselves as simply following the facts or simply commanding what must be done. Every discourse has a hidden truth, something it disavows or conceals, and analysis can reveal this dimension, can show what authority and knowledge cost, what they exclude, what they produce as symptom. Part 9. Sexual difference and the formulas of sexuation. We now approach one of Lacan's most controversial and most debated contributions, his theory of sexual difference. In his later seminars, particularly Encore from 1972 to 1973, Lacan developed what he called the formulas of sexuation, a series of logical notations attempting to formalize the different ways that subjects position themselves in relation to sexual difference, to the phallus, and to jouissance. This theory has provoked intense debate, with some seeing it as a brilliant account of how gender operates symbolically, and others seeing it as irredeemably phallocentric, a rationalization of patriarchy dressed up in logical formulas. First, we must be clear about what Lacan means by sexual difference. He is not talking about biological sex, not about chromosomes or anatomy or reproduction, though these may be involved. Sexual difference in the Lacanian sense is about how subjects position themselves in relation to the symbolic order, in relation to language, in relation to the phallus as the privileged signifier of desire. Crucially, Lacan insists that there is no sexual relation, by which he means there is no complementarity, no natural fit between masculine and feminine positions, no way for two sexes to complete each other and resolve lack. The phallus is not the penis, though they are obviously related. The phallus is a signifier, the master signifier of desire, what marks the difference between having and being, between presence and absence. In the symbolic order, as Lacan describes it, subjects are organized around the question of the phallus. Do I have it? Am I it? What is my relation to it? This organization, Lacan admits, privileges masculinity, makes the masculine the standard against which femininity is defined as lack or absence. Now we come to the formulas of sexuation themselves. On the masculine side, Lacan writes two statements using logical quantifiers. The first says there exists at least one X that is not subject to the phallic function. There is an exception to castration. The second says for all X, the phallic function applies, all are subject to castration. These seemingly contradictory statements define the masculine position. It is defined by a constitutive exception, by the idea that there is one who is not castrated, who has complete enjoyment, who is not limited by the symbolic law. Who is this one who is not castrated? It is the mythical primal father from Freud's Totem and Taboo, the father of the horde who supposedly possessed all the women, who was not bound by the incest prohibition, who had unlimited jouissance. But Lacan insists this father never actually existed. He is a myth, a fantasy necessary to ground masculine identity. By positing an exception, masculine subjects can identify with being like everyone else, as all castrated, all subject to the law, all lacking, but with the secret hope or fear that somewhere there is one who is not, one who has it all. This explains certain features of masculinity, as Lacan understands it. Masculine identification involves relating to an exception, to a figure of authority or mastery who supposedly has complete jouissance. This can be the actual father, but it can also be a leader, a hero, a guru, anyone who seems to embody the phallus, to have what others lack. It also explains masculine anxiety, the constant worry about measuring up, about whether one really has the phallus, the fear of being exposed as lacking, as castrated, as not really a man. Think about traditional masculinity as performed in competition and hierarchy. Men constantly compare themselves, compete for status, try to prove they have the phallus through accomplishments, through sexual conquests, through displays of power. This competition presupposes that someone could have it, that there is a winner, an alpha, a master who is the exception. But of course no one really has the phallus, everyone is castrated, everyone lacks, so the competition never ends, the anxiety never resolves. On the feminine side, the formulas are different. The first statement says there does not exist an X that is not subject to the phallic function, there is no exception to castration. The second says not all of X is subject to the phallic function, not all is determined by the phallus. These statements define femininity as not all, as partially but not completely organized by the phallic signifier, as exceeding the logic of presence and absence, having and lacking. This is Lacan's most contentious claim. He argues that femininity has access to a different form of jouissance, what he calls other jouissance, or feminine jouissance, a satisfaction that is not phallic, that does not operate through the logic of having or lacking, that cannot be fully symbolized or spoken. Women, Lacan claims, know something about jouissance that men do not, but this knowledge is ineffable. It resists articulation. It exists beyond the phallic signifier that organizes masculine sexuality. Lacan invokes mystical experience as an example of this other jouissance. He shows a sculpture of Saint Teresa in ecstasy and asks, is she experiencing something, and if so, what? The mystic's rapture seems to involve a satisfaction beyond language, beyond the pleasure principle, something that cannot be captured in phallic terms of having and lacking. This, Lacan suggests, gives us a glimpse of feminine jouissance, of a satisfaction that is not organized around the phallus as signifier. Let me be clear about what Lacan is and is not saying. He is not claiming that all people assigned female at birth have access to this other jouissance, nor that people assigned male at birth cannot. The formulas describe positions that subjects can occupy, not biological destinies. A subject can occupy the masculine position, the feminine position, or move between them regardless of their anatomy. Moreover, every subject has access to phallic jouissance through the partial drives, and potentially to other jouissance, though Lacan suggests the feminine position has privileged access to the latter. What does this look like, concretely? The masculine subject organizes their desire around objects, around having and possessing, around the logic of lack and satisfaction. They seek the object A that will complete them, orient themselves toward goals and achievements, operate within the economy of desire we have already discussed. The feminine subject, while also operating within this economy, has access to something else, to a relation to the other that is not mediated purely by the phallus, to a jouissance that does not depend on having or lacking any particular object. Think about different orientations to romantic relationships. The masculine position, as Lacan describes it, seeks possession, seeks to have the other as object, worries about whether they really have the other's desire, experiences love through the anxiety of potentially losing what they have. The feminine position has a different relation, one where being loved matters more than having the beloved, where there is less fixation on possession and more openness to a relation that exceeds any particular object or guarantee. This is not because women are naturally more relational, but because the feminine position is structured differently in relation to the symbolic order and the phallus. Now we must confront the feminist critique, which is powerful and in many ways devastating. Luce Irigaray, one of Lacan's most important feminist critics, argues that his entire framework is phallocentric, that it makes the masculine position the standard and defines femininity only in relation to the phallus, as lacking it or being not all in relation to it. Where is the positive content of femininity? Where is sexual difference that does not subordinate femininity to a masculine standard? Why must femininity be defined as other, as mystery, as ineffable, when masculinity gets to be clearly defined and fully symbolized? Irigaray also criticizes Lacan's reliance on mystical ecstasy as a model for feminine jouissance. This, she argues, keeps femininity in the realm of the unspeakable, the beyond, the mystical, rather than recognizing feminine sexuality and pleasure in its own positive terms. It also subtly pathologizes femininity, associating it with dissolution and loss of self, rather than with agency and power. Other feminists point out that Lacan naturalizes patriarchy by making the phallus the privileged signifier. Why must the symbolic order be organized around the phallus? Why not some other signifier? Why not multiple signifiers without one master term? By insisting that this is how the symbolic order works, is not Lacan simply describing patriarchy and then claiming it is a structural necessity rather than a contingent historical arrangement that could be changed? Some defenders of Lacan argue that he is describing how patriarchal society actually functions, not prescribing how it should function, and that his theory reveals the costs and contradictions of phallocentric organization. They point out that Lacan emphasizes the phallus is a signifier, not the penis, meaning it is a product of the symbolic order, not nature, and therefore could potentially be displaced or supplemented by other signifiers. Other Lacanians argue that feminine jouissance, the not all, represents a genuinely subversive dimension, a way of exceeding patriarchal logic, of accessing satisfaction beyond phallic organization. The fact that this jouissance cannot be fully symbolized might be its strength, its resistance to being captured and controlled by the symbolic order. But these defenses often feel inadequate. Why, if Lacan is only describing patriarchy, does he seem to make it universal and necessary, rather than historical and changeable? Why, if feminine jouissance is so important, does he have so little to say about it beyond gestures toward ineffability and mysticism? Why does his theory give us such detailed accounts of masculine structures and only enigmatic hints about feminine experience? Judith Butler and other queer theorists have used and critiqued Lacan's theory of sexual difference to think about gender as performance, as a position one takes up rather than an essence one has. If the masculine and feminine positions are symbolic rather than biological, if they are ways of relating to the phallus and to jouissance rather than natural categories, then gender becomes something we do rather than something we are. This opens possibilities for gender fluidity, for refusing the binary, for occupying positions that do not fit neatly into masculine or feminine. Yet Butler also criticizes Lacan for maintaining the binary itself, for assuming that there are only two positions, even if they are symbolically constructed? Why only masculine and feminine? Why not multiple ways of relating to the symbolic order, to desire, to jouissance? Why does Lacan reinscribe the very binary that we might want to question or dismantle? Contemporary Lacanian feminists like Joan Kopczek have argued that we need to separate what is valuable in Lacan's account from what is limited by his historical moment and his own masculine position. The insight that subjectivity is sexuated, that there is no sexual relation, that desire and satisfaction are structured by the symbolic order, these can be retained while questioning whether the phallus must be the master signifier or whether patriarchal arrangements are as necessary as Lacan sometimes suggests. We can also examine sexual difference through the lens of the four discourses. Traditionally, men have been positioned in the master's or university discourse as those who command or who possess knowledge, while women have been positioned in the hysterics discourse as those who suffer and demand that men explain and cure. These positions are not natural, but are effects of how patriarchal society organizes the symbolic order. Challenging patriarchy means not just including women in positions of mastery and expertise, but questioning these very discursive structures themselves. What remains undeniable is that Lacan raises crucial questions about sexual difference that cannot be simply dismissed. How is gender constructed symbolically? How does language itself encode sexual difference? How do subjects position themselves in relation to desire and satisfaction in ways that are marked by gender? Why does there seem to be no simple complementarity between masculine and feminine sexuality? Why do men and women so often seem to be at cross purposes in love and desire? These are real questions that deserve serious analysis. Lacan's answers may be limited by phallocentrism, by his historical moment, by his own blind spots, but the questions remain pressing. We need theories of sexual difference that can account for how gender operates symbolically without reducing it to biology, and that can recognize real differences without naturalizing patriarchal arrangements. Whether Lacan's formulas of sexuation can be salvaged, reformed, or must be discarded entirely remains an open question in contemporary theory. Part 10. Jouissance, pleasure beyond pleasure. Jouissance is perhaps the most difficult concept in all of Lacanian theory, yet it is absolutely central to understanding his mature work. The French word combines enjoyment, pleasure, satisfaction, and even orgasm, but Lacan uses it in a technical sense that exceeds all these ordinary meanings. Jouissance is satisfaction that goes beyond pleasure into pain, enjoyment that is excessive and disturbing, a form of getting off that we cannot acknowledge as pleasurable, yet that we compulsively pursue. Understanding jouissance means understanding why human beings are not simply pleasure-seeking animals, but creatures who derive strange satisfaction from suffering itself. Freud had already noticed something strange about human psychology, the repetition compulsion, the way people repeat painful experiences, return to traumatic situations, seem to actively seek what hurts them. He tried to explain this through the death drive, an instinct beyond the pleasure principle, a pull toward dissolution and non-existence. Lacan takes up this insight, but transforms it. Jouissance is not a death instinct, but the form of satisfaction available to speaking beings, to subjects who have been split by language, who can never return to simple animal pleasure. The key is that jouissance is satisfaction beyond the pleasure principle. The pleasure principle seeks homeostasis, seeks to maintain moderate levels of excitation, seeks comfortable satisfaction, and then rest. An animal operates according to the pleasure principle. It eats when hungry until satisfied, then stops. But human beings go beyond. They eat until sick. They seek stimulation beyond comfort. They find satisfaction in excess, in transgression, in what hurts. Why does this happen? Because we are speaking beings, because our relation to satisfaction has been mediated by language, by the symbolic order, by the other's desire. We cannot simply satisfy needs. All our satisfactions are caught up in meaning, in fantasy, in the attempt to be what the other desires, in the push towards something beyond any particular satisfaction. Jouissance is what binds us to our symptoms. The symptom causes suffering. The subject consciously wants to be rid of it, yet they remain attached to it. They get something from it. They resist letting it go. This something is jouissance, a toxic satisfaction, a way of getting enjoyment that bypasses desire and the other's desire, that provides a certainty of satisfaction even if that satisfaction presents as pain. Consider the classic example of obsessional neurosis. The obsessive person is tortured by intrusive thoughts, by compulsions they must perform, by elaborate rituals that consume their life. They desperately want relief. They know their behaviors are irrational. They suffer genuinely from their condition. Yet analysis reveals that the obsessive also enjoys their obsession, gets jouissance from it, from the control it provides, from the way it keeps them safe, from having to actually engage with desire, with the other, with the risks of real satisfaction. The rituals provide a certainty, a closed system where nothing unexpected can happen, where jouissance circulates in predictable ways without the anxiety of desire. Or think about addiction again, which we have mentioned but can now understand more deeply. The addict consciously suffers, wants to stop, knows the substance is destroying their life. But the substance provides direct access to jouissance, chemical satisfaction that does not require navigating the anxiety of desire, the uncertainty of the other's desire, the possibility of rejection or failure. The drug says you can have satisfaction without the other, without language, without all the symbolic mediation that makes human satisfaction so complicated and disappointing. This is a lie, of course. Chemical satisfaction is hollow, leaves the subject more empty than before, but it provides that moment of certainty, that direct hit of jouissance, that makes it so difficult to quit. Lacan distinguishes between phallic jouissance and other jouissance, terms we encountered in discussing sexual difference, but must now explore more fully. Phallic jouissance is jouissance organized around the phallus, around having and lacking, around the partial drives, around the localized satisfaction of oral, anal, scopic zones. It is the jouissance available through masturbation, through fixation on particular objects or body parts, through the circulating satisfaction of the drives. Phallic jouissance is limited, finite, organized. It operates through the logic of castration, accepting that complete satisfaction is impossible, that jouissance must be limited, that the symbolic law prohibits unlimited enjoyment. This is the normal human condition, accepting limitation, accepting that we cannot have everything, that satisfaction must be partial and temporary. Other jouissance, or feminine jouissance as Lacan sometimes calls it, is supposedly jouissance beyond the phallus, beyond the logic of having and lacking, beyond limitation. As we discussed, Lacan suggests this is the jouissance of mystical experience, of dissolution of boundaries, of satisfaction that is not localized or organized, but total and ineffable. But he admits he knows very little about it, that it resists symbolization, that women know something about it that cannot be communicated in phallic terms. This distinction has provoked much debate. Some argue that positing other jouissance romanticizes femininity, makes women into mystics who have access to something beyond ordinary experience, which is both essentialist and a way of excluding femininity from normal discourse. Others argue that other jouissance names something important about experiences that exceed phallic organization, that cannot be captured by the logic of desire and lack, that represent genuine alternatives to patriarchal sexuality. We can also think about jouissance in relation to the social bond. Every ideology, every social formation has its own economy of jouissance, its own way of organizing what satisfactions are permitted, what excesses are prohibited, what enjoyments bind people together. Nationalism, for instance, offers a form of collective jouissance, the satisfaction of belonging, of sacrifice for the nation, even the jouissance of violence against those designated as enemies. The nationalist enjoys their identity, enjoys the rituals and symbols, enjoys even the suffering and sacrifice that nationalism demands, because this provides a form of certainty about who one is, a place in a meaningful collective, a jouissance that exceeds individual pleasure. Or consider consumer capitalism's organization of jouissance. Capitalism says you can have unlimited jouissance, you can enjoy without limit, just keep buying, keep consuming, keep seeking new experiences and products. But this supposed unlimited enjoyment is actually limited in a new way. It must pass through the market, through commodities, through exchanges regulated by capital. The jouissance capitalism offers is always disappointing, always leaves you wanting more. But this is precisely the point. Disappointment drives more consumption, more seeking, more accumulation. The superego, in Lacan's reinterpretation, is not primarily the moral conscience, but the agency that commands jouissance. The superego does not say, do your duty. It says, enjoy. You must enjoy. You are not enjoying enough. This helps explain the paradoxical suffering of our contemporary moment. We live in a culture that constantly commands us to enjoy, to have fun, to maximize pleasure, to live our best life, and we feel guilty and inadequate when we do not. The superego's command to enjoy is more tyrannical than any moral prohibition because it can never be satisfied. There is always more enjoyment you should be having, always some way you are failing to maximize your pleasure. Think about the pressure to have an amazing life documented on social media, to have incredible experiences, to enjoy every moment. This is the superego commanding jouissance, and the result is anxiety, guilt, the feeling that you are not living right, not enjoying enough, not getting what you should from life. The more we are told to enjoy, the less we seem able to, because enjoyment commanded becomes obligation, becomes work, becomes one more thing we are failing at. Lacan's late work increasingly focuses on the synthome, spelled with an archaic French form, as a way of naming the subject's unique relationship to jouissance. The synthome is not exactly the same as the symptom. It is the particular way a subject has knotted together the symbolic, imaginary and real, the particular formation of jouissance that makes them who they are. While symptoms might be analysed and dissolved, the synthome is what remains, what cannot be analysed away, what is most singular about the subject. The ethical goal of analysis in this late formulation is not to eliminate the synthome, but to identify with it, to accept this is my particular way of enjoying, this is my singular mode of jouissance, and I can own it rather than being owned by it. This represents a shift from earlier Lacan, less emphasis on desire and lack, more emphasis on accepting the strange satisfactions that constitute one's being, the particular ways one gets off that make no sense but are nevertheless one's own. Critics from many directions have challenged Lacan's concept of jouissance. Some argue it is too broad, too vague, used to explain everything and therefore explaining nothing. Any behaviour can be attributed to jouissance, any attachment, any suffering which makes the concept unfalsifiable and therefore scientifically useless. Others argue that the emphasis on jouissance is morbid, pessimistic, that it reduces human motivation to a kind of death drive, denying the possibility of genuine pleasure, genuine satisfaction, genuine happiness. Why must Lacan always emphasize pain, excess, toxicity, rather than acknowledging that people can and do find real joy, real fulfillment, real pleasure in life? Feminist critics note that the distinction between phallic and other jouissance reinscribes a gender binary, where masculinity is clear and knowable, while femininity is mysterious and ineffable. This keeps women in the position of other, of unknowable, rather than recognizing feminine sexuality and pleasure in concrete, positive terms. Lacanians respond that jouissance is not about denying pleasure, but about recognizing that human satisfaction is complex, ambivalent, never pure, always mixed with pain and excess. We do experience joy, but our joy is never simple. It is always caught up in meaning, in fantasy, in the push toward excess that characterizes human desire. Moreover, jouissance helps explain puzzling phenomena, why people remain in abusive relationships, why they repeat destructive patterns, why satisfaction so often disappoints, all things that simple pleasure-seeking cannot account for. The concept of jouissance is also politically important because it helps us understand fascism, fundamentalism, and other forms of collective violence. These movements offer jouissance to their participants, the satisfaction of belonging, of having enemies to hate, of transgressing normal moral limits in the name of a higher cause. Understanding the jouissance of fascism helps us see why rational arguments often fail, why showing fascists the consequences of their beliefs does not dissuade them, because they are not operating in the register of rational self-interest, but in the register of jouissance, getting something from their commitments that exceeds any rational calculation. Similarly, understanding our own attachments to jouissance can help us recognize why we remain stuck in patterns we know are harmful. If I can see that I am getting something from my suffering, that there is a satisfaction in my symptom, even though I consciously hate it, this creates space for change, for choosing differently, for accepting the anxiety of giving up toxic satisfaction in favor of the risk of genuine desire. Jouissance remains one of Lacan's most powerful but also most troubling concepts. It names something real about human experience, the way we go beyond pleasure into pain, the way we are bound to our symptoms, the way satisfaction is never simple or pure. But it also risks becoming a catch-all explanation, a way of making any behaviour seem necessary or structural rather than contingent and changeable. The challenge is to use jouissance as a critical concept without letting it become a fatalistic acceptance of suffering as inevitable. Part 11. The late Lacan, Topology, Knots, and the Synthome. In his final seminars of the 1970s, Lacan's work took a surprising turn toward topology, toward mathematical knot theory, toward an increasingly abstract and difficult formalization of psychoanalytic concepts. This late period represents both the culmination of his thought and its most challenging expression, a body of work that many find impenetrable, but that others see as his most profound contribution. Here, Lacan moves beyond linguistic models toward topological ones, trying to think the structure of the subject in terms of surfaces, edges, knots, and transformations that resist translation into ordinary language. Topology is the branch of mathematics concerned with properties that remain invariant under continuous deformation. A coffee cup and a donut are topologically equivalent because each has one whole. One can be continuously transformed into the other without tearing or gluing. Lacan became fascinated by topology because it seemed to provide a way to formalize structures that are neither physical objects nor linguistic signs, but something else, shapes and relations that capture how the subject is constituted. Earlier, Lacan had used topological figures like the torus, the Mobius strip, and the Klein bottle to illustrate psychoanalytic concepts. The torus, shaped like a donut, helped him think about how desire circulates, how the subjects inside and outside are related, how what appears as two different trajectories actually belong to the same surface. The Mobius strip, a surface with only one side, illustrated how inside and outside, self and other, conscious and unconscious, are not simply opposed but continuous, flip into each other. The Klein bottle, a four-dimensional surface that cannot be properly constructed in three-dimensional space, helped Lacan think about the subject as fundamentally impossible to represent, as existing only in a dimension that exceeds our intuitive grasp. These figures were not just metaphors, but attempts to formalize the structure of subjectivity in non-Euclidean terms, to show that the subject cannot be thought through ordinary spatial intuitions. But in his final period, Lacan focused particularly on the Borromean knot, a configuration of three rings, linked such that if any one ring is cut, all three fall apart. This became his model for the relationship between the symbolic, imaginary and real, the three registers we discussed earlier. The Borromean knot shows that the three registers are mutually interdependent, none has priority, each requires the others to function, and the subject exists at their knotting, at the point where they hold together. What does this mean clinically? It suggests that symptoms arise when the knot is not properly tied, when one of the registers threatens to come apart from the others, when the subject's reality begins to dissolve. In neurosis, the knot holds but causes suffering, generates symptoms as the price of maintaining the knot. In psychosis, the knot has failed to form properly, particularly in the symbolic register, and the subject must find other ways to bind the registers together. This brings us to the synthome, Lacan's late concept we mentioned briefly before. The synthome is a fourth ring that can be added to the Borromean knot to stabilize it, to repair a fault in the knotting, to hold together what would otherwise fall apart. The synthome is the particular way a subject manages their jouissance. ties together the three registers, maintains their reality even when the ordinary symbolic function is insufficient. Lacan's most famous analysis using this concept is his seminar on James Joyce. Joyce, Lacan argues, was on the edge of psychosis. His symbolic function was compromised. The name of the father did not properly function for him. But Joyce did not become psychotic because his writing, his literary work, his creation of a singular literary style functioned as a synthome, as a fourth ring that stabilized his knot, that held his subjective reality together. Joyce's writing was not just creative expression, but a necessary solution to a structural problem, a way of binding symbolic, imaginary and real when the ordinary mechanisms had failed. This suggests that art, creation and singular solutions can serve vital functions beyond their aesthetic or cultural value. Someone whose symbolic function is fragile might need their creative practice not as therapy, but as the very thing that maintains their existence, that keeps them from psychotic dissolution. This also suggests that what appears as pathology from one perspective, Joyce's linguistic experimentation, his difficulty with ordinary language, his strange relationship to his own body, might be from another perspective the solution, the way he managed to live and create despite structural difficulties. The synthome represents a shift in Lacan's clinical thinking. Earlier, he emphasized interpretation, symbolic analysis, working through the formations of the unconscious. Later, he increasingly emphasized identification with the synthome, accepting one's particular way of enjoying, recognizing that analysis cannot eliminate the real, but only help the subject find a livable relationship to it. The end of analysis is not cure in the sense of becoming normal, but rather assuming one's synthome, owning one's singular mode of jouissance, no longer being mystified by one's own symptoms. Think about what this means practically. Someone comes to analysis with a symptom, perhaps they cannot stop working, they are driven to achieve, it is destroying their relationships and their health. Traditional analysis might interpret this as defending against something, as avoiding desire or intimacy, and might aim to resolve the conflict so the person could work less, could relax, could relate better. Late Lacanian analysis might instead help the person recognize that this driven quality is their synthome, their particular way of managing jouissance, and that the goal is not to eliminate it, but to own it, to say, yes, this is how I am. This is my relationship to enjoyment. Now, how can I live with this rather than being lived by it? This can sound like acceptance of pathology, like giving up on change. But Lacanians argue it is actually more radical than traditional cure because it accepts that the subject is fundamentally symptom, that there is no normal state underneath the pathology, that what we call pathology is simply the particular way this subject is knotted together. The change comes not from eliminating the symptom, but from transforming one's relationship to it, from being the victim of one's synthome to being its author. The turn to topology also represents Lacan's attempt to move beyond language as the sole model for the unconscious. While he maintained that the unconscious is structured like a language, he increasingly emphasized the real, the dimension that resists symbolization, that cannot be captured in signifiers. Topology provided a way to think about structures that are neither linguistic nor imaginary, but something else, forms and relations that can only be grasped through mathematical formalization. This late work has been criticized from multiple angles. Many psychoanalysts, even sympathetic ones, find the topological turn obscure to the point of uselessness. a descent into mathematical formalization that loses touch with clinical reality. What do knots and Klein bottles have to do with actual human suffering, actual therapeutic work, actual change in people's lives? Others argue that Lacan's topology is mathematically sloppy, that he uses mathematical concepts loosely without real rigour, that his appropriation of mathematics is more poetic than precise. Real topologists find his work amateurish, while psychoanalysts find it incomprehensible, leaving it stranded between disciplines without real home in either. Feminist critics note that the late work seems to move even further from questions of gender, sexuality, and politics, retreating into abstract formalization that seems to transcend the messy reality of embodied, situated subjects. The more abstract Lacan becomes, the less his work seems able to address actual social and political questions, actual differences that matter in people's lives. Defenders argue that the topological turn represents Lacan's most rigorous attempt to formalize psychoanalytic concepts, to move beyond the ambiguities of ordinary language towards structures that can be precisely specified. The difficulty is not a failure, but a necessity. These concepts are difficult because what they describe is difficult, because the structure of the subject resists easy representation. Moreover, the concept of the synthome has proven clinically productive, helping analysts think about cases that do not fit standard categories, about subjects who do not respond to interpretation, about singular solutions that cannot be generalized, but that work for this particular person. The synthome allows for a more pluralistic clinical approach, one that respects difference, that does not assume everyone should arrive at the same endpoint. We can also read the late Lacan as a meditation on impossibility and limit. The real cannot be symbolized. The three registers cannot be reduced to one. The subject cannot be made whole. Psychoanalysis cannot provide a cure in the sense of eliminating suffering. These are limits, but they are also what makes psychoanalysis ethical, what prevents it from becoming a master discourse that claims to have all the answers. By insisting on the real, on the not, on the irreducibility of the three registers, Lacan resists any reductionism, any claim that we can fully explain or eliminate the constitutive gaps in human existence. The late work also connects to Lacan's earlier insistence that analysis cannot be standardized, that every analysis is singular, that the analyst must invent with each analyze, and rather than applying pre-established techniques. The Borromean knot and the synthome formalize this singularity, showing why each subject requires a unique approach, why there can be no manual for analysis, why interpretation must be creative rather than merely applied. Whether Lacan's late topology will prove lastingly valuable remains an open question. Some contemporary Lacanians continue to develop these ideas, extending his work on knots and topology, finding new applications and refinements. Others largely ignore the late work, focusing instead on earlier concepts that seem more clinically relevant and more accessible. Still others try to integrate the late work with the earlier, seeing it as deepening rather than replacing what came before. What seems clear is that Lacan to the end resisted any closure, any final systematization of his thought. Just when his concepts seemed to stabilize, he would introduce new complications, new difficulties, new ways of thinking that disrupted what had come before. The turn to topology was perhaps the final instance of this restless thinking, an attempt to push psychoanalysis beyond its own limits, to formalize what resists formalization, to think what cannot quite be thought. Whether this was profound or self-indulgent, necessary or excessive remains a matter of debate. Part 12. Applications, Literature, Film, Politics and Clinical Practice. Lacan's influence extends far beyond psychoanalysis proper. His concepts have been taken up and transformed by literary critics, film theorists, political philosophers and cultural analysts across the humanities. Understanding these applications shows both the power and the risks of Lacanian theory, how it can illuminate phenomena that other approaches miss, but also how it can be misapplied, become jargon or substitute theoretical sophistication for careful attention to specific objects. In literary studies, Lacanian concepts have proven enormously productive. The idea that texts have an unconscious, that meaning is never fully under the author's control, that interpretation must attend to gaps, contradictions and silences, all this resonates with Lacanian theory of the subject and language. A Lacanian reading does not ask what the author intended, but what the text says beyond or against its conscious meaning, what symptoms the text displays, what desires it manages or fails to manage. Consider Shoshana Fellman's Lacanian reading of Henry James's The Turn of the Screw, a novella about a governess who may or may not be seeing ghosts. Rather than trying to decide whether the ghosts are real or hallucinated, Fellman shows how the text stages the very impossibility of this decision, how it makes ambiguity structural rather than resolvable. The text functions like the unconscious itself, saying both yes and no simultaneously, refusing the certainty that readers demand, producing anxiety through its resistance to definitive interpretation. The governess becomes a figure for the reader, someone desperately seeking certainty, seeking to master meaning, but constantly confronted with undecidability. Or consider Slavoj Žižek's readings of detective fiction through the concept of the big other. The detective story promises that crime will be solved, that disorder will be resolved, that the symbolic order will be restored. The detective represents the subject supposed to know, the one who can make sense of what seems senseless, who can restore meaning through interpretation. But Žižek shows how detective stories also reveal the fragility of the symbolic order, how close we always are to chaos, how much work is required to maintain the fiction that reality makes sense. The detective solution is less a discovery than a creation, a narrative that closes what was open, that imposes order on what might have remained ambiguous. In film theory, Lacanian concepts have been central to understanding how cinema positions the spectator. Christian Metz and others used Lacan's mirror stage to explain cinematic identification, arguing that watching films recapitulates the fundamental structure of the ego's formation. The viewer identifies with the camera's gaze, with the unity of the cinematic image, with characters on screen in ways that are both pleasurable and alienating, both self-affirming and other-directed. Laura Mulvey's famous essay on the male gaze in cinema draws on Lacan to argue that classical Hollywood cinema positions women as objects of the look, as passive images to be gazed at, while men are positioned as active lookers, as subjects who drive the narrative. Woman becomes the object A for the male spectator, the cause of desire, the image that promises but cannot deliver satisfaction. Mulvey's analysis helped launch feminist film theory, showing how cinema reproduces patriarchal structures at the level of looking itself. More recently, Lacanian concepts have been used to analyze how horror films work. Horror often deals with the real, with what resists symbolization, with what breaks through the symbolic order and threatens to overwhelm us. The monster in horror films can be read as the real intruding on reality, as Object A in its most terrifying form, as that which should remain hidden but becomes visible, producing anxiety and disgust precisely because it should not be seen. Think of films like Alien or The Thing, where the monster is excessive, uncontainable, constantly transforming, resisting definitive representation. This is the real, as Lacan theorizes it, the dimension that cannot be integrated into our symbolic reality. In political theory, Lacan has influenced thinkers trying to understand ideology, power, and social transformation. Jacques has been the most prominent figure here, using Lacanian concepts to analyze how ideology functions, not simply by deceiving people, but by organizing their jouissance, by providing forms of enjoyment that bind them to existing social arrangements. For Jacques, ideology is not just false consciousness, but involves a disavowal. They know very well what they are doing, but still they do it. People are not simply duped by ideology, they know at some level that it is a fiction, that the leader is not really the answer, that the commodity will not satisfy, but they act as if they believe anyway because the fiction provides a framework for enjoyment, for making sense of things, for having a place in the social order. Think about cynicism in contemporary politics. People say all politicians are corrupt, all institutions are broken, nothing really matters, yet they continue to participate, to vote, to invest themselves emotionally in political struggles. This is not simply hypocrisy, but reveals the structure of ideology, the way we maintain belief through disavowal, the way we get jouissance from our cynicism itself, from the position of the one who knows better but participates anyway. Ernesto Laclau and Chantal Mouffe have used Lacan's concept of the empty signifier to develop a theory of populism and hegemony. Political movements organize themselves around master signifiers like freedom, justice, the people, which do not have fixed meanings, but which different groups try to fill with their own content. Hegemony means successfully imposing your particular meaning on these universal signifiers, making your version of freedom or justice seem natural and necessary. But because these signifiers are fundamentally empty, because there is no ultimate grounding for meaning, political struggle is never finally resolved. Every hegemony contains the possibility of its own contestation. In clinical practice, Lacan's influence has been complex and controversial. In France and parts of Latin America, Lacanian psychoanalysis remains a major therapeutic approach with its own training institutes and clinical standards. Elsewhere, particularly in the United States, Lacanian analysis is marginal, practiced by relatively few analysts working outside mainstream institutions. Lacanian technique differs significantly from other forms of psychoanalysis and from contemporary psychotherapy more broadly. The analyst maintains a position of neutrality, refusing to offer reassurance, refusing to educate or advise, instead punctuating the analyse and speech to highlight moments of significance. Sessions may be of variable length, ending when the analyst judges that something important has been said, leaving the analyse and to work with what was just articulated. The analyst interprets not to explain, but to produce a cut, a rupture that forces the analyse and to confront something they were avoiding. For example, an analyse and might be speaking about difficulties at work, complaining about their boss, describing conflicts with colleagues. At the moment they say something like, "I just cannot say no to people." The analyst might end the session, sending them away with that phrase hanging, requiring them to think about what was just said, about how this inability to say no structures their entire position. The interpretation works not through explanation, but through highlighting a signifier, making it resonate, opening it to new meanings. Critics argue that this technique is manipulative, that it puts too much power in the analyst's hands, that it can be traumatizing rather than therapeutic. The analyst's refusal to reassure or explain can feel cruel. The variable-length sessions create anxiety rather than safety. The whole approach seems designed to destabilize rather than support the patient. Lacanians respond that destabilization is the point, that the goal is not to make the analyzer uncomfortable, but to help them confront the real, to work through their fantasies, to assume responsibility for their desire rather than remaining victims of their symptoms. Analysis is not meant to be pleasant, but to be effective, to produce real change rather than temporary relief. Moreover, the analyst's neutrality is not cruelty, but respect for the analyzer's autonomy, refusing to occupy the position of the one who knows, forcing the analyzer and to become the subject of their own analysis. The evidence base for Lacanian analysis is limited. There are few controlled studies, few systematic outcome measures, little engagement with contemporary research on therapeutic efficacy. This reflects partly Lacan's own resistance to standardization, his insistence that every analysis is singular, that what works cannot be reduced to protocols or measured through quantitative methods. But it also means that Lacanian analysis has difficulty justifying itself to skeptics, has trouble competing with evidence-based approaches in healthcare systems that demand demonstrated effectiveness. Some contemporary Lacanians have tried to develop more systematic research programs, to document clinical outcomes, to engage with neuroscience and cognitive science while maintaining distinctively Lacanian concepts and techniques. Others insist that psychoanalysis cannot and should not try to meet scientific standards of evidence, that it operates in a different register, that its effectiveness cannot be captured by the metrics that work for behavioral interventions. In education, Lacanian concepts have been used to think about teaching, learning, and the structure of pedagogical relationships. Shoshana Fellman argues that teaching, like psychoanalysis, involves a relationship to knowledge that is never simply transmission, that good teaching must work with rather than against resistance, must respect the learner's desire rather than imposing knowledge from outside. The teacher who simply transmits information occupies the university discourse, positioning students as lacking knowledge that the teacher possesses. But transformative teaching might occupy something more like the analyst's discourse, presenting oneself as not knowing, as also searching, creating space for students to produce their own knowledge rather than simply receiving it. The applications of Lacanian theory across disciplines show its remarkable flexibility and generativity. The same concepts, desire, the big other, object A, jouissance, can illuminate phenomena as diverse as horror films, populist politics, and educational practice. This suggests that Lacan captured something fundamental about human subjectivity and meaning-making that transcends any particular domain. But there are risks. Lacanian jargon can become a way of sounding sophisticated while saying very little, a badge of theoretical sophistication that substitutes for careful analysis. Terms like the real or object A can be dropped into discussions without real understanding, creating an appearance of depth that masks superficiality. Moreover, applying Lacanian concepts too rigidly can force phenomena into predetermined categories, losing the specificity and complexity of what is being studied. The most productive applications are those that use Lacanian concepts as tools for discovery rather than as pre-established answers, that test the concepts against their objects rather than simply imposing them, that remain open to modifying or abandoning Lacanian frameworks when they prove inadequate. Lacan himself insisted that psychoanalytic concepts must be constantly reworked, that there is no final doctrine, that rigidity is the death of thinking. The challenge for those who use Lacanian theory is to maintain this openness, this willingness to be surprised, this refusal of orthodoxy. Part 13. Major critiques, limitations, and where Lacan fails. No honest account of Lacan can avoid confronting the serious criticisms that have been levelled against his work from multiple directions. These critiques are not simply misunderstandings or failures to grasp his difficulty, but often identify real problems, real limitations, real failures in Lacanian theory. Engaging with these critiques seriously is essential to understanding both what Lacan accomplished and where his project falls short. The most fundamental criticism is that Lacan's work is deliberately obscure, that his difficulty serves to conceal rather than reveal, that his dense prose and elaborate neologisms function primarily to create an aura of profundity, while avoiding clear argumentation that could be critically evaluated. Critics point out that Lacan often makes sweeping claims without providing evidence, argues through assertion rather than demonstration, and retreats into obscurity whenever pressed for clarification. The philosopher François Roustan, himself a former Lacanian analyst, argued that Lacan created a cult, that his seminars functioned less as genuine teaching than as performances designed to maintain his charismatic authority, that disciples learned to speak Lacanian rather than to think independently. The very difficulty of the work became a badge of membership, a way of distinguishing insiders from outsiders, true believers from those who simply did not get it. This critique has real force. There is something troubling about a body of work that seems to require initiation, that cannot be readily explained to intelligent outsiders, that depends on mastering a specialized vocabulary that seems designed to exclude rather than communicate. If Lacan really discovered important truths about human subjectivity, should not these truths be expressible in terms that do not require years of study to even begin to comprehend? Lacanians respond that the difficulty is necessary because the unconscious itself resists direct representation, because speaking clearly about these matters would falsify them, because analytic truth emerges through indirection and enigma rather than through straightforward exposition. But this defense can seem self-serving, a way of making any criticism into proof that the critic has not understood, creating an intellectual fortress that is impervious to challenge. A second major line of critique concerns the scientific status of Lacanian theory. Critics from cognitive science, neuroscience, and empirical psychology argue that Lacan's concepts are not scientifically testable, that they make no predictions that could be falsified, that they exist in a purely theoretical realm, disconnected from empirical investigation. Alan Sokal and John Brickmont, in their book Fashionable Nonsense, specifically target Lacan for his misuse of mathematical and scientific concepts. They show that Lacan's appeals to topology, to set theory, to mathematical logic are often mathematically nonsensical, using technical terms in ways that bear no relation to their actual mathematical meanings. His famous claim that the structure of the neurotic subject is exactly that of a torus is, they argue, literally meaningless, an empty gesture toward mathematical rigor that actually demonstrates mathematical ignorance. This critique stings because Lacan explicitly claimed to be formalizing psychoanalysis, to be making it rigorous through mathematical models. If these models are mathematically incoherent, then a major part of his project collapses. Lacanians have largely failed to adequately respond to this critique, either dismissing it as scientism that misunderstands the nature of psychoanalytic theory, or conceding that Lacan's mathematics is loose, but insisting the concepts remain valuable. Moreover, there is virtually no empirical research supporting Lacanian clinical claims. Does Lacanian analysis actually help people? And if so, how and for whom, and compared to what alternatives? We simply do not have good answers to these questions because Lacanians have largely resisted the kind of systematic research that would be required to answer them. This leaves Lacanian psychoanalysis in an awkward position, claiming therapeutic efficacy but unable to demonstrate it through methods that contemporary healthcare recognizes as valid. A third major critique comes from feminism, which we have touched on throughout but must now address systematically. Lacan's entire framework is arguably phallocentric, organized around the phallus as master signifier, defining femininity as lack or as mysterious other rather than in positive terms. Even when Lacan seems to valorize femininity, as in his discussions of feminine jouissance, he does so by making it ineffable, unknowable, mystical, which can seem like another way of excluding women from symbolic authority and clear speech. Luce Irigaray argues that Lacan, like Freud before him, assumes that there is one sex, the masculine, and that femininity is defined only as not masculine, as lacking the phallus, as incomplete. For Irigaray, we need to think sexual difference positively as two different modes of being rather than as presence and absence of the same thing. Lacan's framework makes this impossible because it begins from the phallus, making feminine specificity unthinkable except as deficiency or mystery. Moreover, Lacan's concept of the name of the father seems to naturalize patriarchy, to make paternal authority necessary for human subjectivity itself. Even if Lacan claims to be describing how patriarchal society works rather than prescribing how society should work. The universalizing claims of his theory, its insistence that this is the structure of entry into language as such, makes patriarchy seem necessary and inevitable rather than historical and changeable. Judith Butler and other queer theorists have used and critiqued Lacan to develop theories of gender as performance, but they also note that Lacan maintains the heterosexual binary as fundamental, that his formulas of sexuation allow only two positions, masculine and feminine, with no room for gender fluidity, non-binary identities, or ways of being that refuse the binary altogether. A fourth line of critique concerns Lacan's ethics and politics, or rather the apparent absence of clear ethical and political commitments in his work. Lacan claimed to be apolitical, to be concerned with the structure of the subject rather than with social transformation, and while his work has been taken up by left intellectuals, it is not clear that the theory itself implies any particular political stance. In fact, Lacan's emphasis on the impossibility of the sexual relation, the structural necessity of lack, the subject's fundamental division, can seem politically quietist, implying that dissatisfaction is inevitable, that utopian hopes for social transformation are fantasies, that we must accept limitation and impossibility rather than fighting for change. If lack is structural, if the other is necessarily barred, if jouissance must be renounced, what hope is there for creating better social arrangements, for overcoming domination, for achieving greater freedom and equality? Moreover, Lacan's own political stances were often conservative or simply opaque. He made dismissive comments about student protests in 1968. He had little to say about colonialism, racism, or economic inequality. He seemed more interested in protecting the purity of psychoanalysis than in engaging with social struggles. His institutional authoritarianism, his creation of a school organized around his personal authority, his contentious relationships with other analysts, all suggest someone more concerned with maintaining their own position than with democratic or collective forms of organization. A fifth critique concerns the clinical practice that Lacan inspired, particularly his use of short sessions. Critics argue that ending sessions after a few minutes is manipulative, that it creates anxiety and dependency rather than therapeutic alliance, that it allows analysts to see more patients and make more money while providing less care. The International Psychoanalytic Association expelled Lacan partly over this issue, and while Lacanians defend the practice as respecting the logic of the unconscious, skeptics see it as abusive. More broadly, the Lacanian clinical posture of neutrality, of refusing to reassure or advise, of maintaining enigmatic silence, can seem cruel, especially to vulnerable patients who desperately need support and guidance. While Lacanians argue that this is more respectful of patient autonomy than directive approaches, it risks abandoning patients to struggle alone, withholding the human connection and care that may be precisely what they need. A sixth critique concerns Lacan's relationship to his own theory. He constantly revised, contradicted himself, left concepts ambiguous and underdeveloped, refused to provide definitive formulations. While this can be seen as intellectual openness, as refusing dogma, it also means that there is no clear Lacanian position on many questions, that disciples can find contradictory statements to support incompatible interpretations, that the theory remains perpetually unsettled. This makes it difficult to test or refute Lacanian claims, because it is often unclear exactly what is being claimed. A seventh critique, particularly relevant today, is that Lacan's framework is Eurocentric, that it universalizes structures specific to Western patriarchal capitalism, that it cannot adequately account for subjectivity in different cultural contexts. The symbolic order Lacan describes is a particular symbolic order, shaped by Christianity, by Roman law, by capitalist social relations, by European linguistic structures. Can his concepts travel to contexts where kinship works differently, where language operates differently, where the categories of subject and other are constructed differently? Post-colonial critics note that Lacan shows little awareness of how colonial power shapes subjectivity, how racial hierarchies structure symbolic and imaginary identifications, how the violence of colonization creates traumas that cannot be addressed through the Oedipal framework Lacan deploys. His theory seems to assume a universal subject when in fact it describes a situated subject, one shaped by particular histories of European modernity that cannot simply be extended to all human beings everywhere. Finally, we must address the ways Lacan himself behaved unethically. He had affairs with patients, violated boundaries in multiple ways, used his charismatic authority to manipulate and control, created an institutional cult that demanded absolute loyalty. While one might argue that personal failings do not invalidate theoretical insights, they do raise questions about the relationship between his ideas and his practice, about whether there is something in the theory itself that enabled or rationalized his abuses of power. These critiques are serious and largely unanswered. Lacanian theory continues to be practiced and developed, but often without adequately addressing these fundamental challenges. Some Lacanians simply dismiss critics as not understanding, as operating from incompatible paradigms, as asking the wrong questions. But this defensive posture prevents genuine engagement, prevents the kind of self-critique that could strengthen and develop Lacanian thought. What would it mean to take these critiques seriously while still finding value in Lacan? It would mean being willing to revise, to limit claims to appropriate scope, to acknowledge what the theory cannot explain, to engage with empirical research, to recognize historical and cultural specificity, to develop ethical frameworks that Lacan himself did not provide. It would mean treating Lacan as a resource for thought rather than as a dogma to be defended, mining his insights while discarding what is indefensible, using his concepts while remaining open to their limitations and failures. The challenge for contemporary Lacanians is to separate what remains valuable from what must be rejected, to develop the theory in ways that address rather than evade criticism, to acknowledge that Lacan was a thinker of his time and place, whose insights must be reworked for different contexts and different questions. Whether this is possible, whether Lacanian theory can survive the kind of critical scrutiny it has thus far largely avoided, remains an open question. Part 14. Contemporary Scholarly Debates and Lacan's Living Legacy. Today, more than 40 years after Lacan's death, his influence remains powerful but contested. His concepts continue to circulate through multiple disciplines, and his followers continue to debate the meaning and application of his work. Understanding contemporary debates about Lacan means seeing how his legacy has fractured into multiple schools and approaches, each claiming authentic inheritance while developing the work in different directions. Within psychoanalysis itself, there are multiple Lacanian schools with different emphases and different clinical approaches. In France, the École de la cause freudienne, founded by Jacques-Alain Miller, Lacan's son-in-law and literary executor, represents the largest Lacanian organization and claims direct continuity with Lacan's teaching. But there are rival schools, including groups that split off over disagreements about institutional politics, about how to interpret Lacan, about clinical technique, about the role of the analyst in society. These institutional divisions are not merely political, but reflect genuine theoretical disagreements. Some emphasize early Lacan and the symbolic order, focusing on interpretation and the work of analysis through language. Others emphasize late Lacan and the real, focusing on the synthome and the limits of interpretation, on what resists symbolization and must be managed rather than analyzed. Some maintain strict classical Lacanian technique, including variable length sessions. Others have adapted the approach to different contexts and constraints. Miller himself has been a controversial figure, using his control over Lacan's unpublished seminars to shape how Lacan is read and understood. He has slowly released transcripts of seminars over decades, edited and sometimes substantially revised, claiming to clarify Lacan's teaching, but also arguably imposing his own interpretations. Critics argue that Miller has created an orthodox Lacanianism that Lacan himself would have rejected, turning the open-ended questioning of Lacan's seminars into a fixed doctrine. Outside France, Lacanian psychoanalysis has developed differently in different regions. In Argentina and Brazil, Lacan has had enormous influence, with large training institutes and significant presence in universities and public mental health systems. In Britain, the Centre for Freudian Analysis and Research has trained analysts working in the National Health Service, though Lacanian analysis remains marginal compared to other approaches. In the United States, Lacanian analysis is practiced by relatively few analysts, mostly in major cities, working largely outside mainstream institutions. The integration of Lacan with other theoretical traditions has produced creative hybrids and productive tensions. Slavoj Žižek has combined Lacan with Hegel, Marx and German idealism, using Lacanian concepts to revitalize Marxist critique and to analyze ideology, politics and popular culture. His work has brought Lacan to wider audiences, but has also been criticized for oversimplification, for using Lacanian jargon loosely, for prioritizing provocation over careful analysis. Judith Butler has drawn on Lacan, while also critiquing him, using his account of subject formation to develop theories of gender performativity while questioning his phallocentrism and his maintenance of the heterosexual binary. Her work shows how Lacan can be productively used and transformed by feminist and queer theory, how his insights about symbolic construction of identity can be separated from his problematic assumptions about gender and sexuality. Alain Badiou, while critical of psychoanalysis as a whole, has engaged seriously with Lacan, particularly around questions of truth, the real, and the subject of science. Badiou's concept of the event as a rupture in being that creates new possibilities has affinities with Lacanian notions of the real as what disrupts the symbolic order, though Badiou insists on the possibility of fidelity to truth in ways that differ from Lacanian emphasis on structural impossibility. Joan Kopjek and other feminist Lacanians have worked to develop non-phallocentric readings of Lacan, arguing that his concepts can be separated from patriarchal assumptions, that his account of sexuation contains resources for thinking about sexual difference without subordinating femininity to masculinity. This work remains controversial, with critics arguing that Lacan's framework is irredeemably phallocentric and defenders insisting that it contains tools for its own transformation. In literary and cultural studies, Lacanian concepts remain influential, but often in diluted or transformed versions. The big other, the gaze, the real, object A, all circulate through academic discourse, sometimes with careful attention to their original meanings, sometimes as shorthand for ideas that have become detached from their theoretical origins. This popularization has both benefits and costs, making Lacanian ideas more accessible but also risking superficiality and misapplication. Contemporary neuroscience and cognitive science have largely ignored or rejected Lacanian psychoanalysis, viewing it as unscientific, untestable, and incompatible with empirical research on the mind and brain. However, some scholars have attempted dialogue, asking whether Lacanian concepts might be reformulated in ways compatible with neuroscience, or whether psychoanalysis addresses questions that neuroscience cannot touch, questions of meaning, interpretation, and subjective experience that resist reduction to brain processes. Mark Solms and Karen Kaplan-Solms have attempted to integrate psychoanalysis with neuroscience, though their work draws more on ego psychology and object relations theory than on Lacan. Whether specifically Lacanian concepts could be neuroscientifically grounded remains doubtful, given Lacan's emphasis on the symbolic and the real, on structures that seem irreducible to biological or computational processes. The relationship between Lacanian analysis and cognitive behavioral therapy and other evidence-based treatments remains contentious. From the Lacanian perspective, CBT addresses symptoms at the level of conscious cognition and behavior without touching the unconscious structures that produce symptoms, providing temporary relief but not lasting transformation. From the CBT perspective, Lacanian analysis lacks evidence of efficacy, makes untestable claims, and risks causing harm through its confrontational technique and resistance to clear goals and measures. Some practitioners have attempted integration, drawing on Lacanian insights about the unconscious, about transference, about the role of desire, while also using structured techniques and outcome measures. But such integration is difficult because the approaches rest on incompatible assumptions about the nature of mind, about what constitutes evidence, about therapeutic goals and methods. The digital age has raised new questions for Lacanian theory. How do social media, virtual reality, artificial intelligence, and network communication transform the structures Lacan described? Some argue that digital media intensifies imaginary relations, creating echo chambers where subjects are reflected back images of themselves, where the other is reduced to mirror, where the symbolic order fragments into incompatible local discourses. Others see digital technology as creating new forms of the big other, new sites of algorithmic authority that determine what we see, what we desire, what we think possible. The algorithm becomes a contemporary manifestation of the symbolic order, invisible but all-determining, shaping our reality in ways we cannot fully grasp or resist. Still, others focus on how digital communication changes the structure of desire, creating forms of mediated intimacy where we relate to others through images and texts, where presence is always virtual, where satisfaction is promised but perpetually deferred through the logic of the scroll, the swipe, the like. The question of Lacan and race remains underexplored. Lacan himself said almost nothing about race or racism, and his theory seems to assume a universal subject without attending to how racial categories structure subjectivity, how colonization and slavery created traumas that exceed the Oedipal framework, how whiteness functions as an unmarked norm in the symbolic order Lacan describes. Some scholars have begun to develop Lacanian analyses of race, examining how racial identity involves imaginary identifications, how racism structures desire and fantasy, how racial categories function as master signifiers organizing the symbolic order. But this work is nascent and faces the challenge of applying concepts developed in one context to phenomena that may require different theoretical tools. The environmental crisis also poses challenges for Lacanian theory. How can a theory focused on human subjectivity, on language and the symbolic, address our relationship to non-human nature, to ecological catastrophe, to the planet itself as other? Some have used the concept of the real to think about climate change as what resists symbolization, what we know but cannot really accept, what disrupts our normal reality while we struggle to integrate it into meaning. Others have questioned whether Lacanian emphasis on lack and impossibility is compatible with the urgent need for collective action on environmental issues. Whether the theory's pessimism about human nature and social transformation is politically disabling at a moment that requires hope and mobilization. Looking forward, Lacan's legacy seems likely to remain divided and contested. He will continue to influence humanities' disciplines, where his concepts provide powerful tools for cultural analysis, even as they are modified and transformed. In clinical psychoanalysis, Lacanian approaches will likely remain a minority practice, appealing to those who value conceptual sophistication and depth interpretation over empirical validation and short-term symptom relief. The key debates seem likely to continue along familiar lines, whether Lacan's difficulty is necessary or obscurantist, whether his concepts are scientifically legitimate or pseudoscientific, whether his framework can be made non-phallocentric or is irredeemably patriarchal, whether his emphasis on impossibility is realistic or politically disabling, whether his work should be defended in its totality or mined selectively for useful insights. What seems clear is that Lacan cannot simply be dismissed or ignored. He raised profound questions about subjectivity, language, desire, and meaning that remain pressing. He developed concepts that capture dimensions of experience that other approaches miss. He influenced multiple generations of thinkers across disciplines in ways that continue to shape intellectual discourse. But he also produced work that is genuinely problematic, obscure beyond necessity, scientifically questionable, ethically troubling, limited by the blind spots of his historical moment and social position. The challenge for those who engage with Lacan is to think with and against him simultaneously, to use his insights while remaining critical, to recognize both his genius and his failures. Perhaps the most valuable legacy is not any particular doctrine, but a style of thinking, a commitment to difficulty, a refusal of easy answers, an insistence that human subjectivity cannot be reduced to simple formulas, that the unconscious resists mastery, that there is always something that escapes symbolization, that we are fundamentally divided beings who will never achieve the wholeness we unconsciously seek. Whether we accept this vision or not, whether we find it illuminating or limiting, it has shaped how we think about ourselves and others, how we understand desire and satisfaction, how we recognize the ways we are constructed by language and yet exceed any construction. Lacan remains an essential interlocutor, someone we must engage with seriously even and especially when we disagree, whose thought continues to challenge and provoke, whose questions remain more compelling than his answers. This concludes our comprehensive exploration of Jacques Lacan's ideas and philosophy, from his intellectual formation through his major concepts to contemporary debates about his legacy. We have examined the mirror stage and ego formation, the three registers of imaginary, symbolic and real, the name of the Father and entry into the symbolic order, desire and its impossible structure, the graph of desire and linguistic alienation, object small a as cause of desire, the four discourses structuring social bonds, sexual difference and the formulas of sexuation, jouissance as pleasure beyond pleasure, the late work on topology and the synthome, applications across disciplines, major critiques and limitations, and finally the living legacy in contemporary debates. What emerges is a body of work of remarkable ambition and difficulty, of profound insights and serious failures, of concepts that illuminate while also mystifying, of a thinker who remains essential and problematic, whose influence cannot be denied, but whose authority cannot be simply accepted. Lacan challenges us to think harder, to resist easy answers, to accept difficulty and ambiguity, to recognize that human existence is fundamentally split, that we are subjects divided against ourselves, speaking beings who can never fully coincide with our speech, desiring subjects who can never achieve the satisfaction we seek. Whether this vision is liberating or constraining, realistic or pessimistic, profound or pretentious, remains for each of us to decide.